Hello, my friend. Tonight we embark on a journey, not through distant galaxies or forgotten empires, but into a realm perhaps even more mysterious and certainly more intimate: the bedroom, the marketplace, and the philosophical musings of ancient Greece. You'll be stepping back in time, shedding your modern sensibilities like a toga you no longer need, and truly experiencing what it was like to live and love and lust in a world where the rules of attraction were utterly, wonderfully, and sometimes shockingly different. You might think you know a thing or two about history, but trust me, you probably won't survive this mental time travel without a few raised eyebrows and a chuckle or two at the sheer audacity of it all. The way they saw things, the way they acted, it's a stark reminder that human nature is both timeless and wildly adaptable. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from afar, why not drop your location and local time in the comments? It's always fascinating to see where our little history campfire stretches. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on a dusty Athenian street, the sun warm on your skin, the distant chatter of the agora a low hum. Forget everything you thought you knew about sex and relationships, because in this ancient world, the lines are blurred, redrawn, and sometimes erased entirely. Here, the pursuit of pleasure, the propagation of family lines, and the very concept of desire weave into a tapestry far more intricate than our neatly categorized modern views. You'll quickly realize that the Greeks didn't quite share our hang-ups, our moral qualms, or our strict definitions. For them, sex was undeniably a part of life, as natural as breathing or enjoying a good olive. Yet, its expression, its acceptance, and its consequences varied wildly depending on who you were, where you stood in the social hierarchy, and even the time of day. Imagine walking past a stewer, perhaps overhearing snippets of conversation about philosophical debates or the latest political gossip. But then, a quick glance might catch something else: a casual gesture, a lingering look, a subtle signal that hints at the undercurrent of desire that flowed through this society. You see men of all ages, some adorned in fine tunics, others in simpler garb, moving freely. And as you observe them, you begin to grasp the first, perhaps most striking, difference from your own time: the vast landscape of sexual freedom that stretched out before the ancient Greek male. There's a certain nonchalance to it, a lack of the whispered shame or societal judgment that might accompany similar behaviors in your own era. This isn't just about marital fidelity, it's about an entire spectrum of sexual expression that was not only tolerated but, in many contexts, openly accepted. It's a world where the concept of cheating as a moral failing, particularly for men, simply didn't carry the same weight as it does today. Historians still argue whether this widespread acceptance truly meant an absence of personal jealousy, or if societal norms simply dictated a stoic acceptance of certain male behaviors. You might even chuckle at the thought of a modern dating app trying to navigate these complexities, perhaps needing a whole new set of filters just for acceptable extramarital dalliances. You see, for the men of ancient Greece, the world was their oyster, sexually speaking, while marriage was, of course, the foundation for procreation and the continuation of the family line, something profoundly important, almost a civic duty. It didn't necessarily restrict a man's sexual appetite to the confines of his marital bed. Oh no, far from it. Think of it less as a strict monogamous contract and more as a starting point. A man's virility, his desire, was often seen as a natural, even admirable, force. And where did this force find its outlets? Well, beyond the wife, who was primarily for producing legitimate heirs, there was a bustling market of other options. You might imagine bustling brothels, filled with women and young men available for hire, openly operating in the city. There were also the hetairai, a class of highly educated courtesans who moved in elite circles, offering not just sexual companionship but intellectual stimulation as well, something often absent in the domestic sphere of a respectable Athenian wife. It's almost as if society said, "All right, go forth and procreate with your wife. But for everything else, there's a menu of options." It was a pragmatism that might make your modern head spin, a clear division between the serious business of family and the more relaxed pursuit of personal pleasure. The idea of a man being faithful in the modern sense was, for many, a foreign concept, almost quaint. You could even say it was the original don't ask, don't tell policy, but with far less asking and even less telling. As you continue your stroll through this ancient city, you begin to grasp the sheer scope of this male sexual liberty. It wasn't just tolerated. It was, in many ways, an integrated part of the social fabric. You'd see men engaging in relationships that would, in your own time, be neatly categorized and often stigmatized. Here, however, it was simply part of the diverse tapestry of male desire. You might observe an older, distinguished citizen walking with a younger man, their interaction laden with a different kind of intimacy than you're accustomed to. This leads us to one of the most distinctive, and perhaps most misunderstood, aspects of male sexual life in ancient Greece, the practice of pederasty. Now, before your modern alarm bells start ringing, it's crucial to understand this within its historical context. Pederasty, broadly defined, was a relationship between an older man, the Erasts, and a younger, usually adolescent male, the Eromenos. But this wasn't simply about physical intimacy. It was often presented as a form of mentorship, an educational bond where the elder imparted wisdom, civic values, and social graces to the younger. Imagine a sort of finishing school for young men, but with a significant sexual component that was largely accepted. The Erasts was expected to be a guide, a teacher, shaping the Eromenos into a virtuous citizen, ready to take his place in society. It was a formal, often idealized, relationship that had its own set of rules and expectations. For example, it was generally frowned upon for the Erasts to pay for sexual favors, as that would reduce the relationship to mere prostitution. The ideal was a bond of mutual affection and intellectual growth, even if the physical aspect was undeniable. You might find yourself scratching your head, trying to reconcile the image of a wise mentor with the sexual undertones, and that's perfectly normal. It's a concept that truly highlights the cultural chasm between then and now. This practice wasn't uniform across all city-states. In Sparta, for instance, pederasty often had a strong military dimension, focusing on the development of bravery and loyalty among young warriors. In Athens, it was more linked to intellectual and civic education. Historians still argue whether the physical aspect was always central, or if some relationships were indeed purely platonic mentorships, with the sexual element being an idealized, or perhaps exaggerated, component in later philosophical texts. What's clear is that it was a recognized, if sometimes debated, part of the social landscape for aristocratic males. You might even hear a witty remark in the agora, perhaps a wry comment about a prominent Erasts being particularly fond of a new Eromenos with a promising intellect, hinting at the societal awareness and general acceptance of these bonds. It was a far cry from the secretive, stigmatized nature of similar relationships in many later periods of history. One quirky tidbit about this is the expectation that the Eromenos would eventually grow out of the passive role as he matured. He was expected to transition into the active role, pursuing younger boys or women. It was considered unmanly, even shameful, for an adult man to consistently take the passive role in sexual intercourse. This brings us to another fascinating aspect of ancient Greek sexuality. Their framework for understanding sexual acts. They didn't categorize people based on their object of desire, whether you were attracted to men or women in the same way we do with terms like gay or straight. Instead, their focus was on the dynamics of the sexual act itself, specifically the active and passive roles during sex. You see, for the ancient Greeks, the important distinction wasn't who you slept with, but how you slept with them. Were you the penetrator, the active party, or the penetrated, the passive party? This active-passive dichotomy was deeply intertwined with notions of power, social status, and masculinity. The active role was associated with dominance, control, and freeborn male status. To be the passive partner, particularly for an adult, free man, was often seen as submissive and could carry a social stigma, sometimes even equated with the status of a slave or a woman. It's almost as if they said, "Go ahead and enjoy whomever you wish, as long as you're the one in charge." This might feel utterly alien to your modern understanding of sexual identity, where attraction defines who you are. Here, it was more about the performance of gender and social standing within the act itself. You might even find yourself wondering if they had specific active and passive lounges in the baths. Just to keep things clear, a mainstream historical fact is that this distinction profoundly shaped their understanding of sexual morality, far more than the gender of the partner. It implies a fluidity in male desire that is quite distinct from later Western sexual constructs. A world where the lines between heterosexual and homosexual were simply not drawn in the sand. So, as you process this fascinating distinction between active and passive roles, you start to see how ancient Greek male sexuality, while incredibly broad, still operated within its own unique set of social expectations and subtle pressures. You're not just observing individual acts. You're witnessing a finely tuned cultural system. While a man might engage in relationships with other men, or frequent brothels for sexual release, there was still an overriding societal expectation that shaped his life in a fundamental way. He must marry and produce legitimate heirs. This wasn't merely a suggestion. It was a civic and familial duty. Imagine the pressure. Even if a man's heart or his primary sexual desires leaned towards other men, the continuation of his oikos, his household, his family line was paramount. You'd see young men, perhaps fresh from a pederastic relationship, dutifully taking a wife, often in an arranged marriage designed to secure property, consolidate alliances, or simply ensure the birth of future citizens. This means that for many men, marriage was less about romantic love or exclusive sexual partnership and more about a social contract, a practical arrangement. It's almost as if society offered a buffet of sexual experiences but then nudged you firmly towards the main course of procreation. Historians still argue whether this societal expectation truly suppressed same-sex desires within marriage, or if it simply meant that men sought fulfillment for those desires outside the marital home, without any internal conflict. It's a nuanced dance between personal inclination and public duty. You might overhear a father telling his son, "A proper man secures his lineage," perhaps while gesturing vaguely towards a nearby temple of Hera, goddess of marriage. It wasn't about love, not in the romantic sense we often understand it today, but about legacy, about contributing to the polis. This pragmatic approach to marriage meant that while a man might pursue Eros' passionate desire with a courtesan or a young man, he pursued familial affection and staunch natural affection with his wife, who was, above all, the mother of his legitimate children. It's a quirky tidbit that sometimes wives were even seen as guardians of the household, almost like high-status domestic managers, while their husbands sought excitement elsewhere. You might find this arrangement utterly bewildering, especially from a modern perspective that often prioritizes romantic love and sexual exclusivity within marriage. It's like having two separate spreadsheets for your life, one for duties and one for desires. Now, shift your gaze. As you observe the bustling marketplace, you notice fewer women moving about freely. Those you do see are often veiled or accompanied, their presence more subdued, less overtly individualistic than the men. This immediate observation brings you face to face with the starkest contrast in ancient Greek sexual life, the severely restricted sphere of women's sexuality. While men enjoyed a broad spectrum of permissible sexual expression, including extramarital affairs and pederastic relationships, women's lives, and particularly their sexual lives, were largely confined and controlled. You could almost feel the invisible walls that society had erected around them, subtle yet incredibly strong. Imagine being a respectable Athenian woman. Your world, for the most part, revolved around the gymnasium, the women's quarters of the house. Your public appearances were limited, and your interactions with men outside your immediate family were minimal. Your reputation, your tim, was inextricably linked to your modesty, your chastity, and your adherence to domestic virtues. For women, the concept of sexual freedom as men experienced it simply did not exist. It's a sobering realization, a stark reminder of the deeply patriarchal nature of this society. You might even feel a pang of empathy for their plight, living in a world where half the population seemed to operate under an entirely different rulebook. This wasn't just about social decorum. It was fundamental to the very purpose society assigned to women. For an ancient Greek woman, sex was primarily for one purpose, and one purpose only: procreation, and exclusively within the confines of marriage. Her role was to be a vessel for legitimate heirs, to ensure the continuity of her husband's family line and, by extension, the polis itself. You'd hear whispers about the importance of a wife's fidelity, not just for moral reasons, but for the crucial legal certainty of paternity. After all, if the father of the child was in doubt, the very foundation of inheritance and citizenship could crumble. This explains why a wife's sexuality was so tightly policed. It was about controlling property and lineage, perhaps even more than it was about controlling desire. It's a mainstream historical fact that the concept of female chastity was paramount for societal order. You're observing a society where the reproductive capacity of women was not just valued, but rigorously controlled. Imagine the constant vigilance, the social pressure that bore down on every woman from girlhood. Her virginity before marriage was crucial, and her fidelity within it, absolute. This wasn't merely a moral guideline. It was an unwritten, yet fiercely enforced, social law. For a woman, an extramarital affair was not a casual indiscretion. It was a catastrophic transgression that could shatter her reputation, bring shame upon her family, and lead to severe, even violent, consequences. Think about the stark difference. A man's dalliances were often winked at, perhaps even boasted about in hushed tones among male friends. A woman's, however, could result in immediate divorce, social ostracization, and, in extreme cases, even death at the hands of an enraged husband or male relative, legally justified under certain circumstances. You might hear whispers of a woman who was sent back to her father's house in disgrace because of perceived infidelity, her life irrevocably ruined. Historians still argue about the precise frequency of such extreme punishments, but the threat was very real and hung heavy over women's lives. It's a chilling reminder that while one gender enjoyed immense liberty, the other lived under constant surveillance. The double standard wasn't just present, it was the foundation upon which much of their society was built. It makes you wonder, how many quiet acts of defiance, how many secret desires were stifled under such immense pressure. This intense focus on female fidelity meant that any hint of a woman's sexuality straying beyond the procreative function within marriage was met with severe disapproval. Her body, in many ways, was considered the property of her husband and his lineage, a vessel to ensure legitimate heirs. You wouldn't see women openly flirting in the agora or engaging in casual conversations with unrelated men. Their public persona was one of modesty, silence, and reserved demeanor. This extended to their physical appearance as well. Simple dress, limited adornment, and the aforementioned veiling were common for respectable women venturing outside the home. It's a quirky tidbit that even within their homes, women were often segregated to specific quarters, further limiting their interaction and potential for illicit encounters. It was as if their very existence was designed to minimize any opportunity for a sexual expression that wasn't sanctioned by marriage and lineage. You can almost feel the weight of these social restrictions pressing down. Women were not expected to display affection publicly, nor were they encouraged to explore their own desires. Their sexuality was largely controlled and restricted, with very little room for personal exploration or expression outside of their designated role as wives and mothers. The idea of female sexual pleasure, while not entirely absent from ancient thought, some medical texts mentioned it in relation to conception, was certainly not a societal priority or something to be openly celebrated. Contrast this with the male experience, where pleasure was readily sought and often celebrated. It's like two different species inhabiting the same city, operating under fundamentally different laws of nature. This massive disparity underscores the power dynamics at play, where male authority and control were paramount. But let's pivot now to a different corner of ancient Greek society, one that often brings gasps from modern audiences for its sheer openness: prostitution. You might walk past a bustling street in Piraeus, the port of Athens, and see various establishments. Far from being hidden in the shadows, prostitution was a perfectly legal and widely accepted practice throughout ancient Greece. Brothels operated openly, and courtesans, known as hetairai, moved through society with varying degrees of prominence. It wasn't something to be whispered about in hushed tones. It was simply a part of the urban landscape, a recognized service. Industry catering to a diverse clientele. Imagine walking into a taverna and seeing a group of men chatting with hetairai, their laughter echoing. This wasn't scandalous, it was normal. The presence of prostitutes, both male and female, was simply part of the fabric of daily life. It provided an outlet for male sexual desires that couldn't, or wouldn't, be fulfilled within the confines of marriage. In a society where respectable women were confined to the home, prostitutes offered companionship, conversation, and sexual release without threatening the purity of the family line. Historians still argue whether the widespread acceptance of prostitution was purely pragmatic, or if it also reflected a deeper cultural view that sex, in many contexts, was not inherently shameful. What's clear is that it served a distinct social function, providing a controlled outlet for desires that society otherwise sought to contain. It's a mainstream historical fact that Greek cities actively regulated prostitution through taxes and licensing, further cementing its legal status. You might even find yourself thinking, well, that's one way to keep everyone happy, or at least everyone male. As you observe the thriving world of prostitution, you notice that it wasn't a monolithic institution. It encompassed a diverse array of individuals. You'd find women of all ages working as prostitutes, from young enslaved girls to older, more experienced women who had found a means of survival. But it wasn't just women. Young men also engaged in prostitution, offering their services, particularly to older male clients. This wide demographic clientele highlights the varied the landscape of ancient Greece, catering to desires across the spectrum of gender and age. You might see a Stoic philosopher, deep in thought, walking past a busy brothel without a flicker of judgment, simply accepting it as another facet of urban life. The spectrum of prostitution ranged from the lower status brothel workers, often enslaved individuals with no rights or protections, to the highly esteemed These courtesans were often foreigners, sometimes highly educated, skilled in music, dance, and intellectual conversation. They were the companions of prominent men, attending symposia, male drinking parties, and participating in philosophical discussions, often holding a social influence far beyond what a respectable Athenian wife could ever hope for. It's a quirky tidbit that some hetairai even amassed considerable wealth and property, a stark contrast to the legal and economic dependency of married women. You could say they were the original influencers, but with a much more direct impact on powerful men. Historians still argue about the true social standing of hetairai. Were they celebrated figures, or merely glorified prostitutes? The answer likely lies somewhere in the middle, depending on their individual success and the specific social circles they moved within. This brings us to a pervasive underlying attitude that permeates almost every aspect of ancient Greek sexuality. A distinct lack of guilt, especially for men, surrounding sexual expression. Imagine a society where the concept of sexual sin, as many later cultures would define it, simply didn't exist in the same way. While there were certainly social norms and expectations, particularly regarding who could penetrate whom, and the importance of marriage for procreation, the act of sex itself, in its varied forms, wasn't inherently considered morally corrupt or shameful. You wouldn't find men confessing their sins of the flesh to a priest. Such a notion would be entirely foreign. Think about it. No divine punishment threatened eternal damnation for engaging in sexual acts outside of marriage, or with partners of the same sex. The focus was more on civic duty, social order, and personal honor within a human-centric framework. For men, virility and sexual activity were often seen as natural, even desirable traits. It's almost as if they shrugged and said, "It's just human nature, isn't it?" This pervasive tolerance allowed for a more open and less anxious approach to sexuality than would emerge in later, more religiously conservative eras. You might even find yourself wishing for a bit of that easygoing attitude in your own time, just to alleviate some of the modern hang-ups. While sexual activity was undeniably a private matter, performed behind closed doors, it wasn't hidden from public discussion or gossip. You'd often hear casual conversations, perhaps in the public baths or at a symposium, referencing sexual exploits, relationships, and even preferences. It was part of the everyday fabric of social life, something to be discussed, joked about, and sometimes even gossiped over, much like politics or the latest athletic games. You might overhear a group of men discussing the beauty of a young Erythmenos or the charms of a particular hetera without any hint of embarrassment or taboo. It was a fluid, open discourse, quite unlike the hushed tones and euphemisms often employed in your own time. This openness extended to how sex was woven into the very language and symbolism of the culture. Sex was frequently used as a powerful metaphor in ancient Greek literature, drama, and mythology, representing concepts far beyond mere physical union. You'd encounter it symbolizing death and rebirth, the cyclical nature of life, or the raw, primal forces of creation and destruction. Think of the myth of Persephone and Hades, where abduction and sexual union are intertwined with the changing seasons and the bounty of the earth. Or consider the philosophical texts that sometimes used sexual desire as an analogy for the human soul's longing for knowledge or beauty. It's a quirky tidbit that even the phallus itself, far from being solely a symbol of crude sexuality, often represented fertility, prosperity, and good luck, appearing on amulets and public monuments. It wasn't just about pleasure, it was about life force itself. Historians still argue about the precise layers of meaning in these symbolic representations. Were they always profound, or sometimes simply playful? What's clear is that sex was not just an act, it was a potent symbol, a wellspring of meaning that permeated their intellectual and artistic landscape, deeply ingrained into their understanding of the cosmos and the human condition. It truly shows how they could separate the act from the moralistic baggage that later societies would impose. As you delve deeper into the social dynamics of ancient Greece, you'll encounter the symposium, an institution that perfectly encapsulated the relaxed male attitudes towards sexuality and companionship. Imagine yourself invited to one of these gatherings, a private party held in a wealthy citizen's home, primarily for men. You'd recline on cushions, sipping wine mixed with water. Straight wine was considered barbaric. Engaging in lively conversation, poetry, recitation, and philosophical debate. But beneath this veneer of intellectual discourse, a vibrant, often erotic, energy thrummed. This wasn't just a casual get-together. It was a structured event with its own rituals and expectations. You'd see cups being passed around, dice games being played, and flutists or dancers entertaining the guests. And crucially, it was a space where the sexual fluidity of the male elite was not just tolerated, but often celebrated. You might see hetairai present, engaging with the men not just sexually, but intellectually, demonstrating their wit and charm. And yes, the affections between older and younger men. Often the Erastes and Erymenos we discussed would be openly displayed, perhaps with a shared glance, a touch, or even more overt signs of intimacy. The air would be thick with the scent of perfume, the murmur of voices, and the distinct sense of male bonding, often tinged with overt eroticism. It's a mainstream historical fact that the symposium was a central venue for elite, male, social, and sexual interaction. Consider the atmosphere, a controlled environment, away from the watchful eyes of wives and the public scrutiny of the agora, where men could truly let loose. Here, the boundaries of desire seemed to melt away, allowing for a freedom of expression that was a stark contrast to the rigid constraints placed on women. One might even crack a joke, about a particularly lengthy philosophical discussion being nothing more than a thinly veiled excuse to admire a handsome young cupbearer. The prevailing scholarly discussion ponders just how explicit the interactions at these symposia typically became. Were they always overtly sexual? Or did social etiquette sometimes maintain a more restrained erotic charge? It highlights the challenge of reconstructing daily life from historical texts. This brings us to the profound importance of homosocial bonds in ancient Greek society. Beyond the specific relationships of pederasty, strong, often deeply emotional, and frequently eroticized, bonds existed between men in various social settings. Think of the military, where comrades in arms would fight side by side, their lives dependent on each other. The bond forged in battle, the shared peril and triumph, could foster an intense intimacy that blurred the lines between platonic affection and romantic attachment. You might hear tales of famous warriors, their lives intertwined in ways that went beyond mere friendship. It wasn't just the military. These bonds permeated civic life, athletic contests, and philosophical schools. You'd see men training together naked in the gymnasium, competing in sports, or spending hours discussing profound ideas. These shared experiences cultivated deep connections, and for many Greeks, the most intense emotional and intellectual relationships were often found with other men. This isn't to say that all male friendships were sexual, but the capacity for them to become so was an accepted part of the social landscape. A quirky tidbit: some ancient sources suggest that Athenian couples rarely dined together, reinforcing the idea that men found their primary companionship, both intellectual and sometimes sexual, outside the home. It's almost as if society structured itself to encourage male bonding above all else, leaving wives to manage the household. Now, let's circle back to the fascinating figure of the Hittites. You recall them from our earlier discussion about prostitution, but their role deserves a deeper look. These women occupied a unique social stratum, far above common prostitutes. They were often highly intelligent, educated in music, literature, and philosophy, and skilled conversationalists, unlike respectable wives, who were largely secluded and educated primarily in domestic arts. Hetairai were free to move in public, attend symposia, and engage with prominent men on an intellectual level. You might find a famous orator seeking the company of a renowned hetaira for her wit as much as for her physical charms. Imagine a man, after a long day of civic duties, seeking not just sexual release, but stimulating conversation and companionship that his demure wife might not be able to provide. The hetaira filled this void. They were, in essence, the unwives, offering everything a wife couldn't or wasn't allowed to, particularly intellectual and social engagement. Their independence, their education, and their ability to charm and entertain made them highly sought after. Scholarly debate continues over the true extent of their agency. While they were independent in many ways, they still operated within a system dominated by men and were ultimately dependent on male patronage for their livelihoods. Nevertheless, they carved out a significant space for themselves in a restrictive society. It's almost like they were the original socialites, but with a much more explicit business model. Now, as you consider these figures, the hetaira, the young ereminos, the dutiful wife, you might start to ponder how the ancient Greeks conceived of love versus mere lust. Did they distinguish between passionate, all-consuming eros and fleeting physical desire? Absolutely, and their language itself provided the nuances. You see, for them, love wasn't a single, monolithic concept, but a rich spectrum of affections, each with its own flavor and purpose. You might hear a poet speaking of Eros, a powerful, almost divine force, capable of inspiring both intense joy and profound suffering. This was the passionate, often overwhelming desire that could strike unexpectedly, pulling one towards a beloved object, whether a beautiful youth or a captivating hetaira. It was volatile, potentially irrational, and often associated with physical attraction. Then there was philia, a broader term encompassing friendship, loyalty, and affection, the kind of bond you might share with a close comrade or a respected mentor. And storge, the natural affection, often familial love, like that between a parent and child or a husband and wife, a calmer, more enduring attachment. This complex vocabulary for love meant they could dissect their relationships with far more precision than our single word, love, often allows. It's a mainstream historical fact that ancient Greek philosophy ostensibly explored these different facets of love. So, while a man might experience intense eros for a young man or a hetaira, his relationship with his wife was often based on philia and storge, a partnership for the household and the rearing of children. It wasn't necessarily less valid, just different in its primary aim. You might even find yourself wishing your own language had such clear distinctions, making sense of those confusing feelings that often get lumped together. The enduring question for modern scholars remains: how often did eros truly find its way into the sanctioned confines of heterosexual marriage, or was it primarily sought elsewhere? It's a thought-provoking challenge to our romanticized notions of love. This intricate tapestry of desires and distinctions was overseen, in a metaphorical sense, by one of the most powerful and captivating deities in the Greek pantheon, Aphrodite. You'd see her temples, her statues, her image depicted on pottery and frescoes. She wasn't just the goddess of love, she was the embodiment of desire, beauty, pleasure, and procreation. Her influence on ancient Greek sexual attitudes was profound and pervasive. Imagine a world where the very act of desiring, of feeling passion, was seen as a divine impulse, a gift, or sometimes a mischievous trick from a goddess. Aphrodite sanctioned, encouraged, and even reveled in sexual expression. Her myths often depicted her in various affairs, highlighting a divine permissiveness that mirrored, to some extent, the male liberties on earth. She was worshipped not just by lovers, but by sailors, courtesans, and anyone seeking fertility or charm. Her presence meant that sex, in many ways, was infused with a sacred quality, or at least a powerful, natural one, rather than being inherently sinful. You might find a small, votive offering to Aphrodite at a shrine left by someone, hoping for a successful romantic encounter, or perhaps a fertile marriage. This underscores a quirky tidbit. The Greeks saw no contradiction in worshipping a goddess who was both the patron of prostitutes and the guardian of marital fidelity, illustrating their complex and non-judgmental approach to sexual diversity. Moving from the divine to the mundane, you might wonder about sexual education. How did young Greeks learn about sex? It certainly wasn't through formal classroom instruction or explicit parental discussions in the way you might imagine. Knowledge was primarily transmitted informally through observation, peer interaction, and perhaps practical experience. You'd probably pick up more by listening to older boys, observing the daily life around you, and experiencing rites of passage than from any specific lecture. For boys, learning about sex would likely involve conversations with older male relatives, or mentors, perhaps even their erased. visits to gymnasia where nudity and physical prowess were celebrated, and eventually encounters with prostitutes. It was a learning by doing, or at least a learning by observing and discussing approach. For girls, the education was far more restrictive, almost entirely focused on preparing them for their role as wives and mothers. They'd learn about domestic duties, child rearing, and the importance of chastity and obedience, largely from their mothers and female relatives within the confines of the home. The closest they might get to sexual education would be practical advice related to marriage and childbirth, whispered behind closed doors. Scholarly debate continues as to whether there were any more formal, albeit private, instructions for aristocratic girls about their marital duties. You could say it was less sex ed and more life ed, with very different curricula depending on your gender. As you absorb the idea of this informal, gender-segregated sexual education, you'll naturally turn your gaze to the visual landscape of ancient Greece, and you'll find that sexual themes were openly portrayed in ancient Greek art and pottery. Imagine walking through a bustling workshop or visiting a wealthy home and seeing pottery adorned with scenes that might make you blush in your own time. This wasn't some hidden, illicit art form. It was integrated into everyday objects and public displays. You'd see red figure and black figure vases depicting symposium scenes with men engaged in sexual acts, sometimes with other men, sometimes with her phallic symbols were common, not just as erotic imagery, but often as symbols of fertility and good fortune. You might see satyrs and maenads in wild orgiastic revelry, embodying unbridled natural desires. These artistic expressions weren't considered pornographic in the modern sense. Rather, they reflected a society that, for men especially, had a more open and less moralistic view of the human body and its pleasures. It's a mainstream historical fact that explicit sexual imagery was common on pottery used at symposia. Think of it, images that would be relegated to adult-only sections in your society were openly displayed on drinking cups, serving vessels, and even public sculptures. This widespread artistic representation underscores the societal acceptance of various forms of sexual expression, at least for male viewers. It's almost as if they saw nothing to hide, nothing to be ashamed of when it came to the physical realities of desire. You might even find yourself wondering if they ever had awkward dinner parties where the serving platter had a particularly vivid depiction of a mythological tryst. The prevailing academic discussion explores the intended audience and function of such art. Was it purely for entertainment, a pedagogical tool, or did it carry deeper, ritualistic, or social meanings? This openness truly reflects a different cultural framework for interpreting images of sexuality. From the visual, let's shift to the intellectual, philosophical views on desire. The great thinkers of ancient Greece, Plato, Aristotle, and others, didn't shy away from pondering the nature of desire, eros, its origins, its purpose, and its control. Their discussions often wove together ideas of love, beauty, virtue, and the pursuit of knowledge. You'd find these ideas debated in the academy, in the lyceum, or during those aforementioned symposia. Plato, for instance, in his symposium, presents a series of speeches on the nature of love, elevating eros from mere physical attraction to a desire for ultimate beauty and goodness, a path towards philosophical enlightenment. For Plato, the highest form of eros was not about physical gratification, but about the intellectual and spiritual ascent, moving from the love of a beautiful body to the love of beautiful souls, and ultimately to the love of beauty itself. This implies that while physical desire was a starting point, it was meant to be transcended. You might hear a philosopher muse about channeling one's eros, not towards fleeting pleasures, but towards the pursuit of wisdom. It's a quirky tidbit that Socrates, Plato's teacher, despite being portrayed as embodying this higher, philosophical eros, was also known for his blunt observations about physical attractiveness. This tension between the corporeal and the transcendent was a constant theme. Historians still argue whether Plato's ideal eros was a reflection of actual practices, or a philosophical aspiration that few could achieve. It's clear that even for the most intellectual, desire was a powerful force to be reckoned with. Now, let's turn our attention to how the ancient Greeks understood sex from a more practical, albeit rudimentary, standpoint. Their medical understanding of sex. Imagine a physician in ancient Greece, perhaps Hippocrates, or one of his followers, trying to make sense of the human body and its functions without the benefit of modern science. Their theories about sex and reproduction were often intertwined with beliefs about humors, vital forces, and the balance of the body. You'd encounter ideas about the role of seed, both male and female, in conception, though their understanding of female anatomy and ovulation was, by modern standards, incredibly limited. For example, some theories suggested that female seed also contributed to the formation of the child, and that a woman's pleasure was important for conception, ensuring that her seed was released. This is a mainstream historical fact, illustrating that while patriarchal, some medical texts did acknowledge female pleasure, albeit for a practical outcome. They also had theories about fertility, impotence, and various sexual ailments, often attributing them to imbalances in the body's humors or divine displeasure. You might even hear a physician prescribing a specific diet or a regimen of exercises to improve a man's virility or a woman's fertility. It's almost comical to imagine the advice given, some of it perhaps surprisingly effective, much of it likely based on superstition rather than scientific observation. The continuing scholarly debate concerns the influence of these medical theories on everyday practices related to contraception and abortion, which were certainly known, even if their efficacy was limited. As you consider the ancient Greek medical theories, you recognize that their understanding, while rudimentary, at least attempted to explain the physical aspects of sex. But beyond the biological, the profound influence of mythology and sexual narratives cannot be overstated. You'd grow up hearing these stories, sung by bards, recited in plays, and depicted in art, shaping your understanding of desire, power, and the chaotic nature of the divine. These myths were not merely bedtime stories. They were fundamental texts, offering lessons, cautionary tales, and archetypes for human behavior. Imagine sitting in a courtyard, listening to a storyteller recount the exploits of Zeus, his numerous affairs, often involving him transforming into various animals to seduce mortals and goddesses alike. A swan for Leda, a bull for Europa, a shower of gold for Dano were common knowledge. These tales depicted divine beings engaging in all manner of sexual acts, both consensual and non-consensual, with a casualness that might shock your modern sensibilities. The gods were powerful, often flawed, and certainly not constrained by human morality. Their sexual escapades, therefore, set a precedent for a more uninhibited approach to desire in the mortal realm. At least for those with power, it's a mainstream. The historical fact that the Olympian gods often served as examples of both admirable and transgressive behavior, including sexually. Then there are the stories of Aphrodite, born from the sea foam, embodying pure desire, and her passionate, often illicit affairs. particularly with Ares, the god of war. You'd also hear of Dionysus, the god of wine, revelry, and ecstasy, whose cult involved ecstatic rituals that sometimes included sexual license. These myths presented a pantheon where sexuality was rampant, powerful, and often a source of both creation and conflict. They didn't preach a singular, restrictive morality, but rather explored the full spectrum of human and divine desire, with all its complexities and consequences. You might even find yourself chuckling at the sheer audacity of some of the divine exploits, wondering if the Greeks ever got tired of Zeus's predictable animal disguises. A particularly quirky tidbit is how often violent abduction or rape was depicted in myths as the origin of new lineages or the cause of significant events like the Trojan War triggered by Paris's abduction of Helen. This reflects a cultural acceptance of male dominance and force in sexual matters that is jarring from a contemporary perspective. The pervasive scholarly debate revolves around the extent to which these mythical narratives justified or merely reflected real-world sexual violence and male control over female bodies. It's a complex and often uncomfortable aspect of their rich mythological heritage. Now, let's step outside the realm of myth and into a very public, very physical arena: athletics and nudity. You might find yourself at the Pan-Hellenic Games, perhaps the Olympics themselves, and witness something truly astonishing to your modern eyes: male athletes competing entirely naked. This wasn't some niche underground practice. It was the norm. The gymnasium, the training ground, was also a place where men exercised and socialized in the nude. Imagine the sight: sculpted bodies glistening with oil, competing in wrestling, discus throw, or running, completely unclad. This practice reflects a profound cultural comfort with the male body, celebrating its strength, beauty, and athletic prowess without shame. Nudity, for freeborn men, was often associated with virtue, discipline, and citizenship. It wasn't seen as inherently sexual in a debauched way, but rather as natural and aesthetically pleasing, a sign of cultivation and health. You might hear an elder remark on the perfect physique of a young athlete, admiring it much like one would a piece of art. This normalized nudity certainly had implications for sexual attitudes. It meant that male bodies were constantly on display, admired and judged. This visual environment undoubtedly contributed to the prominence of pederastic relationships, fostering an aesthetic appreciation for the youthful male form. It's almost as if they said, why cover up such perfection? The enduring academic discussion explores whether this widespread male nudity truly desexualized the body, or if it merely facilitated and normalized same-sex desire within certain contexts. A mainstream historical fact is that this practice distinguished Greek athletic culture significantly from most other ancient civilizations, where nudity in public would have been seen as scandalous. Finally, let's consider some of the more esoteric aspects of ancient Greek sexuality, sexual rites, and cults. While not mainstream practices for all citizens, certain religious cults engaged in practices that involved varying degrees of sexual license or symbolic sexual acts as part of their worship. You might hear hushed whispers about the rites of Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and fertility. His followers, particularly women known as Maenads, would engage in frenzied ecstatic dances in the wilderness, sometimes consuming wine and raw meat, experiencing a shedding of inhibitions that could include sexual activity. These were not everyday occurrences, but rather special, liminal events where the normal rules of society were temporarily suspended in pursuit of divine communion and release. You could almost feel the raw, primal energy radiating from such gatherings, a powerful counterpoint to the more ordered civic life. It's a quirky tidbit that some scholars suggest these rites offered a rare opportunity for women to experience a form of communal, uninhibited expression, albeit under strict ritualistic control. The continuing scholarly debate ponders whether these were truly orgiastic rituals involving widespread sexual acts, or if the sexual license was more symbolic and ecstatic, focusing on a spiritual communion rather than physical indulgence. Regardless, they reveal a fascinating dimension of religious experience intertwined with human desire. As you continue your deep dive into the world of ancient Greek sexuality, you'll find that one factor consistently overlays every single aspect we've discussed: social hierarchy and its profound impact on sex. Imagine navigating a society where your birth, your wealth, and your legal status didn't just determine your political rights or economic opportunities, but also dictated who you could have sex with, how openly, and with what consequences. It was a stratified system, and sexual interactions were very much a part of that stratification. You see, the extensive sexual freedom enjoyed by men was primarily, though not exclusively, a privilege of freeborn citizens. A man of high status could engage with hetairai, visit brothels, and participate in pederastic relationships without fear of social ruin. His social standing insulated him from the judgment that might fall upon someone lower down the ladder. It's a mainstream historical fact that power dynamics fundamentally shaped permissible sexual behavior. Conversely, while a wealthy citizen might enjoy a wide array of sexual options, a poorer free man might have fewer opportunities, or his choices might be limited to lower status prostitutes. The notion that sex is sex, regardless of who is involved, simply didn't apply in this class-conscious world. You might hear a wealthy patron jesting about his latest conquest, while a working-class man might never dream of such public displays or access to hetairai. This hierarchy also dictated the active-passive roles we discussed earlier. While it was perfectly acceptable for a free man to be the active penetrator with anyone, women, slaves, or younger males, it was generally considered shameful for a free adult male to be the passive partner, particularly with another free man or a subordinate. To be penetrated by someone of lower status, or to habitually take the passive role, could imply a loss of masculinity or social standing. It's almost as if they had a mental scoreboard, and the active points always had to be higher. This is where status truly intersected with sexual acts, reinforcing power structures even in the most intimate moments. The ongoing academic discussion explores how flexible these roles truly were in practice, and whether individual personalities could sometimes override strict social norms. Now, consider the most vulnerable group within this sexual hierarchy: the role of slaves. Their position was precarious, stripped of legal rights, and often exploited. In the realm of sexuality, their vulnerability was absolute. Enslaved individuals, both male and female, were often at the sexual disposal of their owners. You can imagine the bleak reality for many, where consent was not a concept that applied to them. Female slaves were frequently used as concubines or prostitutes within households or in public brothels. Their bodies were considered property, and their sexual labor could be a source of income or convenience for their owners. For male slaves, too, sexual exploitation was a grim reality. They could be used by male owners or even by female owners, though the latter was less common. This was not a matter of choice or desire on the part of the enslaved person. It was a coercive system born of their utter lack of freedom. You wouldn't hear a slave discussing their sexual preferences, as that was a luxury entirely out of their reach. It's a sobering thought, a dark stain on the otherwise seemingly liberal sexual attitudes of the Greeks. A particularly disturbing, yet important, quirky tidbit is that children born to enslaved women were automatically slaves, regardless of the father's status. This further incentivized the sexual exploitation of female slaves, as it provided a continuous supply of labor. This stark reality serves as a powerful counterpoint to the celebratory narratives of male sexual freedom. While free men enjoyed wide liberties, often extending to access to enslaved bodies, the enslaved themselves possessed no such rights. The long-standing scholarly debate grapples with the extent to which this constant sexual exploitation of slaves undermined or reinforced the seemingly liberal attitudes towards sex among free citizens. It presents a profound ethical challenge to our understanding of ancient Greek society. As our journey through ancient Greece nears its end, you start to consider the enduring impact, the legacy and modern echoes of these fascinating and often perplexing sexual attitudes. You might find yourself drawing parallels, however faint, to aspects of your own society, or recognizing just how much has changed, and perhaps how much remains stubbornly the same about human desire. The ancient Greek emphasis on male bonding and pederasty, for instance, has fueled modern discussions about historical homosexuality and the fluidity of sexual identity across cultures. You see echoes of that active-passive distinction in certain contemporary subcultures, though reinterpreted through a vastly different lens. Their casual acceptance of nudity in athletic contexts resonates in modern body positivity movements. Even if the context is entirely different, it's almost as if they laid out a blueprint for exploring sexual possibility, which later societies either embraced, rejected, or reinterpreted. Consider how much of your own culture's moral framework around sex derives from later Abrahamic traditions, which often stand in stark contrast to the relative permissiveness of the ancient Greeks. You realize that normal sexual behavior is a cultural construct, incredibly malleable across time and place. The ancient Greeks offer a powerful reminder that there isn't one universal right way to approach sex, love, or desire. It's a MAINSTREAM historical fact that the study of ancient Greek sexuality continues to inform and challenge contemporary understandings of gender and sexual orientation. You might even find yourself pondering if the persistent fascination with ancient Greece, particularly its sexual norms, is precisely because it offers such a radically different model from our own, forcing us to question our assumptions and broaden our perspectives. As you continue to reflect on the legacy of ancient Greek sexuality, you recognize that their attitudes, radical as they might seem to a modern mind, weren't entirely free of complexity or internal contradictions. You might think of the sheer pragmatism that underlay many of their seemingly liberal views, the need for procreation, the maintenance of social order, the clear lines of property and inheritance. It wasn't simply a form, it was a system, albeit one vastly different from your own. The ongoing scholarly debate explores the extent to which philosophical ideals of love and desire truly influenced everyday sexual practices, or if they remained largely theoretical pursuits for the elite. This duality, this tension between the ideal and the practical, is a recurring theme when you look closely at any historical society. You might find yourself pondering how their views on male sexual freedom, almost boundless by your standards, coexisted with such stringent restrictions. On women, this imbalance wasn't merely a quirk. It was a fundamental power dynamic, deeply embedded in their legal and social structures. The fact that a man could openly pursue Hittarian young men, while his wife was confined to the domestic sphere and punished for any hint of infidelity, speaks volumes about the gender roles and authority that defined their world. It's a mainstream historical fact that this double standard was a defining characteristic of ancient Greek society. You might even find yourself wondering if any ancient Greek woman ever secretly wished for a time machine just to escape the confines of her gilded cage. Consider the pervasive influence of their mythology, where the gods themselves set a precedent for a range of sexual behaviors, from consensual unions to outright abductions. These stories, far from being just tales, provided a cultural script, a framework for understanding the powerful, sometimes chaotic, forces of desire. They normalized many behaviors that later cultures would demonize, reminding you that morality is often a fluid concept, shaped by context and belief systems. It's almost as if they said, if Zeus can do it, who are we to judge? This mythological backdrop undoubtedly contributed to the relative lack of guilt surrounding many sexual expressions, particularly for men. A quirky tidbit, even in their architecture, the Greeks sometimes subtly incorporated sexual symbols. Think of the phallic stones used as boundary markers or fertility symbols, visible parts of the public landscape. These weren't hidden, they were simply there, part of the visual language of their world, reflecting an integrated acceptance of the sexual dimension of life. This contrasts sharply with many later periods where such symbols would be relegated to the shadows or seen as scandalous. Now, let's take a momentary step back and consider how these ancient attitudes connect or disconnect with the modern world you live in a time grappling with its own complexities surrounding gender, sexuality, and identity. The ancient Greeks, in their own way, explored a remarkable range of possibilities, even if those possibilities were often dictated by social hierarchy and gender inequality. Their open discussions about pederasty, their acceptance of prostitution, and their lack of a rigid gay-straight dichotomy offer a powerful counter-narrative to many of the assumptions deeply ingrained in your own culture. You might reflect on how much of your current understanding of normal sexuality is a product of specific historical and religious developments that came after the ancient Greeks. The concepts of sin, chastity, and strict monogamy that dominate many modern Western views were not the default in this ancient world. This historical distance allows for a liberating perspective, challenging you to question the universality of your own cultural norms. It's almost like looking through a kaleidoscope and seeing a familiar pattern reconfigured in a completely unexpected, yet strangely coherent way. The enduring fascination with ancient Greek sexuality, you realize, isn't just about historical curiosity, it's about by examining how they lived, how they loved, and how they defined desire, you gain a deeper understanding of the malleability of human nature and the profound influence of culture on what is considered acceptable, desirable, or taboo. Their world, with its celebrated male bodies, its intellectual hetairae, and its pragmatic approach to marriage, stands as a testament to the diverse ways humanity has organized its most intimate lives. You feel a subtle shift in the air, a gentle pullback towards your own time, the echoes of philosophical debates, the scent of olive oil from the gymnasium, the distant laughter from a symposium. They begin to fade. But the knowledge, the understanding of a world so different yet so human remains with you. Now, imagine a scene not in a bustling city, but in the quiet, disciplined environment of a Greek household, you would see the clear division of labor and the strict spatial segregation that profoundly impacted sexual life. For the wife, her world was primarily the oikos, the home. Her main purpose, as we've noted, was to manage the household and produce legitimate heirs. This domestic confinement, far from being a minor detail, significantly shaped her opportunities for sexual expression and interaction. You might observe the mistress of the house moving gracefully through the women's quarters, overseeing the weaving, the food preparation, and the rearing of children. Her interactions with men would be largely limited to her husband and close male relatives. Any external contact would be carefully monitored, emphasizing her purity and loyalty to the family. It's a mainstream historical fact that respectable women had extremely limited public roles and were largely confined to the home. This domestic isolation ensured the purity of the lineage, a cornerstone of Athenian society. It's almost as if society built a very comfortable but very secure cage around its female citizens. This rigid control over women's bodies and sexuality extended even to the marriage bed. While modern notions might emphasize mutual pleasure, the primary function of sex within marriage for a Greek woman was reproductive. Her pleasure, while perhaps acknowledged in some medical texts for its role in conception, was not the central focus. You might never hear a wife discussing her sexual desires or satisfactions. Such conversations would be deemed highly inappropriate and immodest. The prevailing scholarly debate concerns the extent to which women internalized these societal expectations, or if they privately harbored desires and frustrations that were never openly expressed. It's a silent, almost invisible aspect of ancient Greek women's lives that we can only infer. A quirky tidbit is the concept of the epikleros, an Athenian heiress who, if her father died without male heirs, was legally bound to marry her nearest male relative, even a half-brother or uncle, to ensure the continuation of the family line and its property. Her body and its reproductive capacity were literally a legal instrument. You can sense the immense pressure on these women, their very existence often serving a function for the state and family rather than their own individual desires. Transitioning from the household, let's consider another aspect of male sexual freedom: the public baths and gymnasia. These weren't just places for hygiene and physical exercise. They were significant social hubs, particularly for men, where bodies were openly displayed and admired. Imagine the steam-filled atmosphere, the scent of oil and sweat, and the murmur of male voices. You'd see men of all ages, from youths to elders, exercising, conversing, and relaxing in the nude. This widespread comfort with male nudity created an environment where the male form was constantly visible, celebrated, and sometimes aesthetically appreciated in ways that often bordered on the erotic. It was here, amidst the physical exertion and camaraderie, that many of the homosocial bonds we discussed earlier were formed and reinforced. The beauty of the male body was admired openly, much like a sculpture. It's a mainstream, historical fact that male nudity in gymnasia was a standard practice, reflecting a distinct cultural perspective on the body. This public display of the male body, combined with the lack of a rigid gay-straight dichotomy, certainly contributed to the acceptance and prevalence of same-sex desire among men. You might observe an older man subtly admiring a younger athlete's physique, or overhear jokes and banter that hinted at sexual undertones. It's almost as if the gymnasium served as a constant visual affirmation of male beauty, a backdrop against which desires could freely manifest. The ongoing scholarly discussion centers on whether the exposure to nudity truly desexualized the body, or simply presented it as a constant object of potential desire, thus normalizing same-sex attraction. In a specific context, it highlights the complex interplay between visual culture and sexual behavior. A quirky tidbit: some sources suggest that young men would apply fine dust or sand to their oiled bodies before wrestling, not just for grip, but also to enhance the visual appeal of their muscles, almost like ancient bodybuilders flexing for an audience. This conscious beautification of the male form further underscores the aesthetic and potentially erotic dimension of these spaces. The baths were, in essence, a sensory experience designed to celebrate the male body in its raw, unadorned state. As you continue to mentally wander through ancient Greece, you'll find that while much of their sexual landscape seems remarkably open by modern standards, particularly for men, there were still unspoken rules and subtle codes governing behavior. It wasn't a free-fall, but rather a system with its own logic. This leads us to consider the concept of shame and honor as it related to sexuality, particularly for males. For a free Athenian man, while expressing desire for other men or for women outside marriage was generally accepted, the manner of that expression was crucial. To be seen as weak, effeminate, or to lose control of one's desires could bring dishonor. The concept of sophrosyne, or self-control and moderation, was highly valued. While pleasure was sought, excessive indulgence or a perceived lack of mastery over one's passions could be viewed negatively. You wouldn't want to be known as someone who couldn't control their urges, even if those urges were themselves deemed natural. It's a mainstream historical fact that honor and shame played a vital role in regulating social behavior, including sexual conduct. This is where the active-passive dichotomy we discussed earlier becomes even more significant. For an adult-free man, taking the passive role in sexual intercourse was often considered shameful, as it implied submission and a loss of masculine dignity, potentially aligning him with the status of women or slaves. To be penetrated implied a lack of control, a vulnerability that was antithetical to the ideal of the free, dominant male citizen. You might hear a sneering remark in the Agora about a man who behaves like a woman or who lets himself be ridden, revealing the sharp sting of social disapproval. It's almost as if they said, "Go wild, just make sure you're always on top," metaphorically and literally. The enduring scholarly discussion delves into the precise social consequences of taking the passive role for free men. Was it universally condemned, or were there subtle exceptions or private tolerances? A quirky tidbit: some ancient Greek insults for men focused precisely on this, questioning their manliness by implying they were passive sexual partners. These weren't just crude jokes, they were attacks on one's very social identity and honor. It shows how deeply embedded this active-passive paradigm was in their understanding of masculine virtue. Now, let's consider the concept of fertility and its ritualistic importance. Beyond the pragmatic need for heirs, the ancient Greeks imbued fertility with deep religious and communal significance. You would encounter numerous cults and festivals dedicated to promoting fertility in crops, animals, and humans. These rituals often had overt or symbolic sexual elements. Imagine attending a Dionysian festival, perhaps a rural celebration in honor of the god of wine and revelry. Phallic processions, where large symbolic phalluses were carried through the streets, were a common feature. These weren't intended to be explicit in a lewd sense, but rather as powerful symbols of life, abundance, and generation. They were prayers for a bountiful harvest, for healthy offspring, and for the continued vitality of the community. You might see villagers dancing, feasting, and engaging in light-hearted banter, all infused with an underlying sense of joyous celebration of life's generative forces. It's a mainstream historical fact that phallic symbols were prominently featured in fertility cults and festivals. These rituals often blurred the lines between the sacred and the profane, incorporating elements of revelry and sometimes communal sexual expression or suggestive acts as part of their worship. The goal wasn't necessarily individual pleasure, but the collective well-being and continuation of life. The prevailing academic discussion explores the exact nature of these orgiastic rituals. Were they always literally sexual, or did the release refer more to emotional and spiritual liberation? This connection between sexuality and the Earth's bounty highlights a holistic worldview where human procreation was intrinsically linked to the cycles of nature. It's almost as if they saw human sex as a microcosm of the universe's own creative power. A quirky tidbit during some festivals, like the rural Dionysia, a giant phallus would be paraded through the fields, believed to bless the land with fertility. Imagine your modern-day farmers performing such a ritual before planting their crops. It puts a whole new spin on going green. This reminds you of the profound integration of sexual symbolism into the very fabric of their agricultural and spiritual lives. Finally, let's explore the cultural depiction of female desire, or rather, its frequent absence or negative portrayal. While male desire was celebrated and explored in myriad ways, female desire was often either ignored, condemned, or depicted as dangerous and uncontrollable if it strayed beyond the bounds of marital procreation. You would rarely find positive depictions of female sexual agency or pleasure in mainstream literature or art, unless it was in the context of divine figures like Aphrodite, or in the case of foreign othered women like Amazons, whose unrestrained sexuality was often a mark of their perceived barbarity. Respectable Greek women were meant to be demure, modest, and silent, their desires subservient to those of their husbands and the needs of the oikos. If a woman expressed too much desire, she risked being labeled a moikalous adulteress or simply shameless. The long-standing scholarly debate considers whether this artistic silence truly reflected a lack of female desire, or merely a societal suppression of its public expression. You are observing a society deeply invested in controlling female sexuality. Imagine the stories your grandmother might have told you, but amplified 1,000-fold with societal pressure, when female desire was depicted, particularly in plays or cautionary tales. It was often associated with chaos, madness, or destruction. Think of Medea, driven by passionate, vengeful desire, or Clytemnestra, whose ambition and illicit love led to regicide. These characters served as stark warnings about the dangers of female emotions, especially sexual ones, when left unchecked. It's a mainstream historical fact that female sexuality, outside of its procreative function within marriage, was often viewed with suspicion and fear, seen as potentially disruptive to social order. This pervasive fear of unbridled female desire meant that opportunities for women to express themselves sexually were severely limited. Their bodies, their desires, and their very existence were largely defined by their roles as daughters, wives, and mothers within a patriarchal system. You might hear a man praising his wife for her modesty and quiet nature, qualities that directly contrasted with the overt expressions of desire he might seek elsewhere. It's almost as if they needed women to be the steady, predictable anchors of the household, precisely because male desire was allowed to be so expansive and unpredictable. A quirky tidbit. Some ancient medical texts posited that women could become hysterical if they did not engage in sexual activity, suggesting a pragmatic, if patronizing, acknowledgement of female sexual needs, albeit framed in terms of pathology. The ongoing scholarly discussion continues to explore the extent of female agency within these restrictive bounds. Did women find ways to subtly express their desires or form intimate bonds with other women that defied societal norms? The sources are sparse, often written by men, leaving much to interpretation and speculation. It's a historical silence that speaks volumes about the suppression of female voices. Now, let's turn our attention to the role of wine in ancient Greek sexuality. You've already glimpsed it at the symposium, but its influence was far broader, acting as a social lubricant, a ritualistic component, and a catalyst for loosening inhibitions. Imagine the flow of wine at a feast, its rich aroma filling the air, slowly unwinding the careful composure of its drinkers. Wine, particularly diluted wine, was a central part of Greek social life. From daily meals to grand celebrations, it was associated with Dionysus, the god of revelry and ecstasy, and its consumption was believed to facilitate a state of ecstasis, stepping outside of oneself, a release from everyday constraints. This loosening of inhibitions naturally extended to sexual expression. At symposia, for example, as the wine flowed more freely, conversations could become bolder and interactions more overtly sexual. You might witness flirtations intensify, or affections between men become more openly displayed under the influence of the grape. It's a mainstream historical fact that wine played a significant role in loosening social strictures, particularly. For men, however, there was a fine line. Drunkenness to the point of complete loss of control was generally frowned upon for free citizens, as it implied a lack of sophrosyne self-control, which was a virtue, but a pleasurable buzz, just enough to lower one's guard and encourage a more uninhibited atmosphere, was precisely the point. It's almost as if they said, drink just enough to become more interesting, but not so much that you fall off your couch. A quirky tidbit is the ritualized way wine was mixed with water in a crater, a large mixing bowl. The precise ratio of wine to water was debated and believed to influence the outcome of the symposium. Too strong, and it could lead to chaos. Too weak, and it would be dull. The prevailing scholarly discussion often debates whether the sexual expressions encouraged by wine were truly spontaneous, or if they were merely a performance within a pre-existing cultural script. Did wine genuinely alter behavior, or just provide a convenient excuse for behaviors that were already subtly permitted? Regardless, it served as a powerful cultural tool for modulating social and sexual interactions. Finally, let's consider the subtle yet significant presence of euphemisms and hidden meanings in discussions of sexuality. Despite the relative openness, not everything was said directly, especially when it came to sensitive or intimate matters. You might find yourself listening closely to a conversation, trying to decipher the layers of meaning beneath the polite phrases. Ancient Greeks, like any culture, had their own ways of talking around certain subjects. While the art could be explicit, spoken language sometimes employed euphemisms, particularly in formal settings or when discussing female sexuality. For example, instead of directly referring to sexual intercourse, texts might use phrases like to sleep with, to have relations, or more poetical allusions. This wasn't necessarily about shame, but about decorum, or perhaps a playful subtlety. You might hear a reference to visiting Aphrodite's garden as a polite way to mention a brothel visit. This kind of veiled language added a layer of sophistication, or perhaps a sense of privacy, even in a society that seemed so open. It's a mainstream historical fact that cultures often develop euphemisms for sensitive topics. You're beginning to grasp the delicate dance between openness and subtlety in ancient Greek discourse, a fascinating contrast to their often explicit art. This use of veiled language and allusions didn't necessarily indicate shame, but rather a sophisticated understanding of context and audience. It was a way to communicate intimate ideas without necessarily being crude, a form of verbal artistry. The ongoing scholarly discussion examines how these euphemisms might have reflected deeper societal anxieties or sensitivities, particularly around female sexuality, even in a culture that otherwise seemed so uninhibited. A quirky tidbit: some ancient Greek jokes relied heavily on double entendres and sexual puns, showcasing their cleverness with language and their comfort with weaving sexual themes into everyday humor. Imagine a stand-up comedian in the Agora, delivering a witty line that made half the audience chuckle knowingly, while the other half might miss the underlying meaning entirely. This sophisticated play on words further demonstrates the pervasive, yet sometimes subtly expressed, presence of sexuality in their daily lives. It's almost as if they said, "We'll talk about it, but sometimes we'll make you work for the punchline." Now, let's explore the intriguing, albeit often overlooked, aspect of gender-fluid roles within mythology and cult. While societal norms for gender roles were generally quite rigid, especially for women, Greek mythology and certain religious practices occasionally presented figures or situations that blurred these lines, offering glimpses of a more complex understanding of gender and identity. Imagine stories of deities like Dionysus, often depicted with effeminate features, or Hermes, who sometimes crossed gender boundaries. There are also myths of Tiresias, the prophet who experienced life as both a man and a woman, gaining unique wisdom from his dual perspective. These figures, while not necessarily advocating for social gender fluidity, certainly presented models where the rigid male-female binary could be transgressed, at least in the divine or mythical realm. It's a mainstream historical fact that mythological figures often challenged conventional gender norms, providing cultural outlets for complex ideas about identity. Furthermore, some cults or rituals involved cross-dressing or the temporary adoption of gender roles contrary to daily life, often as a means of connecting with the divine or achieving a state of altered consciousness. You might hear whispers of women performing male roles in certain religious ceremonies, or men adopting more feminine attire during Dionysian rites. These instances, while exceptional and ritualized, suggest a cultural capacity to conceive of gender beyond strict biological definitions, even if such fluidity wasn't widely accepted in everyday social interactions. The enduring scholarly debate concerns whether these mythological and ritualistic instances truly influenced real-world gender perception, or if they merely served as contained, symbolic transgressions without wider social impact. Moving beyond direct sexual acts, let's consider the aesthetic appreciation of the human form and its inherent connection to sexual attraction. For the ancient Greeks, beauty, particularly physical beauty, was not just admired. It was often seen as a reflection of divine order, a sign of virtue and excellence. This profound aesthetic sensibility naturally extended to the human body, influencing everything from sculpture to daily interactions. You would constantly encounter idealized depictions of the human form in their art. Muscular male figures, graceful female forms, celebrated for their perfection and balance. This wasn't merely about anatomical accuracy, it was about capturing an ideal. This constant exposure to idealized bodies fostered a culture of appreciation for physical beauty, which inevitably intertwined with sexual attraction. You might hear an elder praising the kalakatithya of a young manner, term encompassing both physical beauty and moral goodness, highlighting the integral connection between physical appearance and virtue. It's almost as if they saw a beautiful body as an outward sign of an inner, beautiful soul. This aesthetic appreciation, especially for the male form, deeply influenced pederastic relationships, where the beauty of the Araminos was often a primary source of attraction for the arists. But it wasn't just about raw desire, it was about admiring perfection. This mainstream historical fact highlights how Greek culture deeply valued and publicly celebrated human physicality. It wasn't merely about sex, but about the profound connection they drew between beauty, virtue, and desirability. You might even find yourself instinctively admiring the elegant lines of a sculpted torso, realizing how deeply ingrained this aesthetic was. A quirky tidbit is the concept of charis, which refers to a certain grace, charm, or captivating quality that went beyond mere physical beauty. Someone could be beautiful but lack charis, while another might possess it in abundance, making them uniquely attractive. It's almost like the ancient Greek equivalent of charisma, but with a distinctly erotic undertone. You're now keenly aware that in ancient Greece, beauty was not just skin deep. It was a pathway to admiration, desire, and even philosophical contemplation. This aesthetic sensibility permeated public life, creating an environment where the visual was constantly intertwined with the erotic. The ongoing scholarly debate explores whether this idealization of beauty created unrealistic standards, and how it might have impacted those who did not conform to them. Now, let's turn our attention to marriage customs and their sexual implications. While we've already touched upon marriage as primarily for procreation and lineage, delving into the customs themselves reveals more about the sexual dynamics within these unions. Imagine a young Athenian woman, perhaps in her mid-teens, being prepared for her wedding. This was not a love match in the modern sense. It was an arranged alliance, often between families of similar social standing. The marriage ceremony itself was less about romantic declarations and more about ritualistic transfer of the bride from her father's authority Kyrios to her husband's. You might observe rites involving processions, feasting, and symbolic acts designed to ensure fertility and good fortune. The consummation of the marriage was, of course, a critical part of the process, legally establishing the union and initiating the wife's primary role as a childbearer. It's a mainstream historical fact that marriages were primarily economic and social arrangements, not romantic ones. You can almost feel the weight of expectation on the young bride, her future defined by her ability to produce male heirs. For the woman, sex within marriage was her sanctioned, indeed expected, sexual outlet. For the man, it was a duty to his oikos and the polis, ensuring the continuation of his line, while his broader sexual needs could be met elsewhere. This practical division meant that the emotional and sexual intimacy we often associate with marriage today was not necessarily its primary function. The husband and wife often lived in separate parts of the house, and their daily lives could be quite segregated. It's a quirky tidbit that some sources suggest a certain level of affection could grow between spouses over time. But this was likely a result of shared domestic life and child rearing, rather than an initial passionate connection. The prevailing scholarly discussion often questions the emotional lives of these married women. Did they find satisfaction, or did they largely endure their marital duties? The silence of the sources on female perspectives makes this a difficult area to fully understand. It presents a stark picture of marriage as a duty, not necessarily a pleasure cruise. Next, let's consider the fascinating but sometimes darker side of ancient Greek sexuality, sexual violence, and coercion. While we've highlighted the openness and relative permissiveness for free men, it's crucial to acknowledge that consent, as understood in your modern world, was not a universal concept, particularly when social hierarchies were involved. Imagine the vulnerability of enslaved individuals. Their bodies were considered property, and sexual access to them was often seen as a right of the owner. You wouldn't find legal protections against sexual exploitation for slaves. Indeed, the act itself wouldn't be classified as rape in the same way if the perpetrator was the owner. This stark reality means that, for a significant portion of the population, sex was not a matter of choice, but of coercion. It's a mainstream historical fact that slaves had virtually no legal recourse against sexual exploitation by their masters. You can almost hear the silent screams of those who suffered without voice or protection. Beyond slavery, women, even free women, were also vulnerable, especially to abduction or rape. While male citizens could face penalties for raping another free citizen, the focus was often on the violation of the Kyrios' male guardian's property rights or honor, rather than solely on the woman's bodily autonomy. The infamous story of the rape of the Sabine women, while Roman, echoes a broader ancient worldview where male force could be a means of acquiring women. The lingering scholarly debate concerns the precise legal and social consequences for male citizens who committed sexual assault against free women. Were these penalties truly deterrents, or were they often mitigated by social status? It's a challenging aspect of ancient law that reveals the limits of their progressive attitudes. A quirky tidbit: in some ancient Greek legal systems, the penalty for seduction persuading a free woman to have sex could be higher than for rape. This is because seduction was seen as a greater threat to the male guardian's authority and honor, as it implied a corruption of the woman's will, whereas rape was a clear act of force. It's a bizarre inversion of modern justice, highlighting the immense value placed on a woman's purity as property. Finally, let's turn to the role of children in discussions and practices of sexuality. This is a sensitive area, and it's important to approach it with historical context, rather than imposing modern moral frameworks directly. As you recall from our discussion of pederasty, adolescent males were often involved in sexual relationships with older men. You are now considering a truly complex aspect of ancient Greek society, one that often generates the most discomfort in a modern listener: the involvement of children, specifically adolescent males, in sexual relationships. As we touched upon, with pederasty, this practice was a recognized, if sometimes debated, part of their social fabric. It's crucial to understand that their concept of childhood and adolescence was different from yours. A young man, once he reached puberty and often into his late teens, was considered ready for certain adult interactions, including sexual ones. Particularly as the Araminos in a pederastic relationship, this wasn't simply about sexual gratification. For the older man, as discussed, it was intertwined with mentorship and education. The Araminos was meant to learn wisdom, civic virtue, and social graces from his arrests. The sexual aspect was often framed as a component of this broader educational bond, a way of cementing the connection and passing on knowledge. You might imagine a scene where an older citizen patiently explains the intricacies of Athenian democracy to a younger boy, with an underlying current of affection that was both intellectual and physical. It's a mainstream historical fact that pederasty was an accepted, though not universal, form of male-male relationship in various Greek city-states, particularly Athens and Sparta. However, it's vital to distinguish this from what modern society would unequivocally term child abuse. The eromenos was typically an adolescent, often post-pubescent, and there were social expectations about the eraseds not exploiting or debauching the youth. The relationship was ideally meant to be reciprocal in terms of benefit, even if the power dynamics were clearly skewed. The prevailing scholarly debate focuses intensely on the precise age of consent, which varied and was often implicitly understood rather than legally codified, and the extent to which these relationships were genuinely consensual and beneficial for the eromenos, or if they often involve coercion, particularly for boys from poorer families. It's a very uncomfortable area for modern sensibilities, and one where the historical sources leave much room for interpretation. A quirky tidbit: in some regions, it was considered more honorable for the eromenos to eventually move on and take an active role himself, either with women or younger boys, rather than remaining perpetually passive. This reinforced the idea that pederasty was a phase, a rite of passage, rather than a permanent sexual identity for the youth involved. It suggests a societal expectation of sexual fluidity and development as a man matured. Now, let's consider the role of slaves in the provision of sexual services. Beyond general exploitation, enslaved individuals, both male and female, formed the backbone of the ancient Greek sex industry, operating in brothels or as household concubines. Their lives were dictated by the demands of their owners, often without any personal agency. Imagine the porneon, a brothel, often a busy establishment near the city's port or market. Here, enslaved women and young men would work, their bodies available for hire to free male citizens. You'd see these individuals living in extremely harsh conditions, with little to no hope of escape or improvement in their lives. They were commodities, their sexual labor a source of profit for their owners. It's a mainstream historical fact that a significant portion of prostitutes in ancient Greece were enslaved. You can almost feel the weight of their despair, the sheer indignity of their existence, a stark contrast to the freedoms enjoyed by their patrons. Male slaves were also often used as sexual servants by their male masters. In the private household, a male slave could be expected to provide sexual services to the male head of the household. This wasn't framed as a homosexual act in the modern sense, but rather as an exercise of a master's right over his property. The scholarly debate constantly highlights the absence of consent for enslaved persons, making these interactions inherently exploitative regardless of the desires of the master. It's a crucial reminder that the sexual freedom of free men often came at the direct expense of the utter lack of freedom for the enslaved. A particularly grim, quirky tidbit: some sources indicate that slave owners might breed slaves, sometimes specifically for sexual purposes, to produce more enslaved individuals. This truly underlines the dehumanizing aspect of slavery and how it intertwined with the sexual exploitation of human beings. Finally, let's reflect on the profound impact of the rise of Christianity on sexual attitudes in the Western world, and how it dramatically diverged from the ancient Greek worldview. You are about to witness a seismic shift in moral paradigms. a complete reevaluation of what is considered acceptable or sinful. With the advent of Christianity, concepts like sexual purity, celibacy, and strict monogamy gained immense importance. The human body, once celebrated in its nude form, became something to be veiled and controlled. Sexual desire, particularly outside the confines of procreative marriage, was increasingly viewed as sinful, a temptation to be resisted. You would see the emergence of moral codes that sharply condemned adultery, homosexuality, and prostitution, marking a profound break from the more tolerant approach of the Greeks. It's a mainstream historical fact that early Christian teachings introduced a far more restrictive and guilt-ridden view of sexuality than existed in pagan antiquity. This transformation fundamentally reshaped Western civilization's approach to sex, creating a legacy that persists to this day. You are now standing at the precipice of a monumental shift. Imagine the ancient Greek world with its celebratory nudity, its pragmatic approach to various sexual expressions, and its lack of inherent guilt, slowly but surely being eclipsed by a new moral order. This new order, brought forth by Christianity, would fundamentally redefine sin, purity, and the very purpose of human desire, casting a long shadow over the permissive attitudes of antiquity, where Greek philosophy might celebrate eros as a pathway to higher beauty. Christian theology often viewed lust as a dangerous distraction, a direct challenge to spiritual purity. The body, once a source of aesthetic admiration in the gymnasium, became a potential source of temptation and a vessel to be controlled and subdued. You would see a gradual but profound change in artistic depictions, in literature, and in everyday social norms. Public nudity became scandalous, same-sex relations became anathema, and extramarital sex became a grave sin. It's a mainstream historical fact that the ascetic ideals of early Christianity greatly contrasted with the more hedonistic aspects of pagan, Roman, and Greek cultures. You might feel a pang of melancholy watching this vibrant, sensual world slowly retreat into the shadows of a new, more restrictive age. The prevailing scholarly debate often centers on how much of this shift was a direct imposition of Christian dogma, and how much was a gradual evolution of existing societal trends. Was it a sudden revolution or a slow, grinding cultural transformation? Regardless, the impact was undeniable. The concept of original sin and the emphasis on spiritual purity led to a far more guarded and often guilt-ridden relationship with sexuality for generations to come. It's almost as if the lights dimmed on the joyful, uninhibited dance of Dionysus, replaced by the hushed solemnity of a church service, a quirky tidbit during the transition. Some early Christian thinkers actively reinterpreted classical Greek philosophy, trying to reconcile pagan wisdom with Christian morality, often by downplaying or spiritualizing the more explicit aspects of Greek sexuality. It was an intellectual wrestling match, trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. This reinterpretation subtly erased some of the nuances we've been exploring, shaping later Western understanding of ancient Greece, Tao. Let's pull back from the grand historical sweep and consider the daily realities of courtship and seduction in ancient Greece, specifically in Athens, where much of our detailed information comes from. For free men, this was a multifaceted game, played across various social arenas. Imagine a young Athenian man, perhaps in his late teens or early 20s, looking for a partner. If he sought a wife, it would likely be through his father or male relatives, arranging a match with a suitable family. The courtship for marriage was often formal and indirect, with little room for romantic wooing. You wouldn't see him serenading his intended beneath her window. Such an act would be scandalous for a respectable maiden. It's a mainstream historical fact that arranged marriages were the norm for free citizens, prioritizing family alliances and property. However, if he sought sexual companionship or romantic entanglement outside of marriage, the avenues were far more varied and direct. He might frequent brothels, seeking the company of prostitutes, or he might visit the hetairai, those educated courtesans who offered both physical pleasure and intellectual stimulation. Seduction in these contexts would involve charm, wit, gifts, and perhaps a good poetic recitation at a symposium. You might hear him boast to his friends about his clever tactics, or complain about the high price of a particular hit-or-ass company. It's almost like having a separate set of social rules for wife hunting versus pleasure hunting. For relationships, particularly pederasty, seduction often took place in the gymnasium or other public spaces where older men could observe and admire younger boys. The wooing could involve gifts, shared intellectual pursuits, and public displays of admiration. The goal was to persuade the Araminos that the erased was worthy of his affection, offering not just sexual attention but mentorship and social advancement. The ongoing scholarly discussion debates the agency of the Araminos in these relationships. What extent could they genuinely consent or refuse, particularly when the older man might be wealthy or influential? For women, however, the concept of courtship and seduction was almost entirely absent, or it was viewed as a dangerous and transgressive act if initiated by them. A respectable woman was meant to be passive, to be chosen, not to choose or pursue. If a man tried to seduce a free woman outside of marriage, it could be considered moesia or adultery, regardless of whether sex occurred, and could lead to severe penalties for the man and social ruin for the woman. A quirky tidbit: ancient Greek love poetry, while often passionate, rarely depicted women actively pursuing men in a romantic or sexual context. It was almost always the male gaze, the male pursuit, that dominated the narrative. This reinforces the idea that female desire was largely meant to be hidden or non-existent in the public sphere. You are now fully immersed in the subtle nuances of ancient Greek social interaction, where the pursuit of desire was a complex dance, tightly choreographed by gender and status. As you consider the differences in courtship, it becomes clear that there was no singular dating scene as you might understand it. Let's delve deeper into the role of music and dance in sexual expression. Imagine the sounds that filled the air at a symposium, beyond the clinking of cups and philosophical chatter. Music and dance were integral parts of these gatherings, often serving to heighten the senses and loosen inhibitions, creating an atmosphere ripe for erotic expression. You might hear the sweet, reedy sound of the aloes, a double pipe instrument, or the gentle strumming of the lyre. These instruments would accompany songs, often love poems or drinking songs, whose lyrics could range from profound reflections on eros to bawdy jokes. Professional musicians, often hetairai or slaves, would provide the entertainment, their performances adding to the sensual ambience. It's a mainstream historical fact that music was an essential component of the symposium, influencing its mood and promoting camaraderie. Dance, too, played a role, though perhaps less formally. You might see a guest or a professional dancer performing, their movements perhaps suggestive or expressive of desire. These performances weren't necessarily explicit, but they contributed to the overall atmosphere of revelry and release. The interplay of music and dance created a sensory experience that naturally enhanced the erotic undertones of the gathering. making it easier for flirtations to escalate or for affections to be openly expressed. You might even find yourself tapping your foot to a lively tune, feeling the infectious energy of the room. The ongoing scholarly discussion debates the exact nature of these dances. Were they purely aesthetic, or did they always carry an inherent sexual invitation? It's a challenge to interpret ancient movements from static texts. A quirky tidbit: some ancient Greek musical modes were believed to evoke specific emotions or even moral qualities. The Lydian mode, for instance, was sometimes associated with softness and effeminacy, suggesting that even the choice of music could subtly influence the perceived mood or sexual atmosphere of a gathering. It's almost as if they had a playlist for every mood, including Let's Get Seductive. Next, let's explore the concept of love potions and magical practices related to sex. While much of their sexual life was grounded in social norms and opportunities, there was also a fascinating undercurrent of belief in magic and supernatural intervention to influence desire and attraction. Imagine a heartbroken lover, or someone desperate to win the affection of a reluctant beloved. They might turn not just to persuasion, but to a professional sorcerer or a practitioner of magic. You'd find references to spells, charms, and love potions designed to inspire passion, compel affection, or even cause impotence in a rival. These concoctions often involved strange ingredients, incantations, and ritualistic actions. It's a mainstream historical fact that belief in magic, including love magic, was widespread in ancient Greece. These magical practices reveal a more anxious, perhaps desperate, side of desire, particularly for those who felt powerless in matters of the heart, while mainstream society provided ample outlets for male desire. Individuals who were rejected or who sought to exert control over another's will might resort to these forbidden arts. You might hear hushed rumors about a rival's sudden impotence, secretly attributed to a vengeful spell or a newfound obsession that seemed too sudden to be natural. It's almost as if they had a black market for desire, for when conventional methods failed. The continuing academic discussion debates the efficacy of these potions. Were they merely placebos, or did they contain actual psychoactive substances? Regardless of their chemical properties, their psychological power was undoubtedly real. A quirky tidbit: some ancient Greek defictions, or curse tablets, have been found with inscriptions designed to bind a lover or prevent a rival from engaging in sexual activity. Imagine someone secretly burying a lead tablet inscribed with a curse, hoping to sabotage a competitor's love life. It reveals a darker, more manipulative side to the pursuit of desire. Finally, let's consider the impact of war and military service on male sexuality. Ancient Greece was a land of constant conflict, and military service was central to the identity of free male citizens. This shared experience of warfare profoundly shaped male bonding and, in some contexts, facilitated same-sex relationships. You would see young men training for battle, fighting side by side, their lives dependent on each other. The intense camaraderie, the shared peril, and the profound loyalty forged in combat often deepened emotional and physical bonds between soldiers. In some city-states, like Thebes, there was even the famous Sacred Band, an elite military unit, composed of 150 pairs of male lovers, believed to fight with greater ferocity to protect their beloved. It's a mainstream historical fact that military contexts often fostered strong male-male bonds, sometimes with a sexual dimension. You can almost feel the powerful connection between these men, a bond forged in the crucible of battle, transcending mere friendship. You're now envisioning the intense, life-or-death crucible of ancient Greek warfare, a context that not only forged unbreakable bonds, but also allowed for a specific kind of male intimacy to flourish. The idea that soldiers would fight harder, more bravely, with a lover beside them, was a powerful motivator, recognized and even cultivated in some military structures. This highlights how practical considerations could intertwine with sexual expression in unexpected ways. The ongoing scholarly discussion centers on whether these military relationships were primarily sexual, or if the sexual aspect was merely one facet of a deeper, more profound comradeship and shared dedication to the state. It's a testament to the complex nature of human connection under extreme pressure. A quirky tidbit. Some ancient Greek tales of heroic friendships, like that of Achilles and Patroclus, are interpreted by many as having a romantic and sexual component, suggesting that such bonds were not just tolerated, but celebrated in epic narratives. Imagine the stories being told around a campfire, celebrating not just valor, but the deep affection between warriors. This blurring of lines between heroic friendship and romantic love is a fascinating aspect of their narrative tradition. Next, let's explore the role of art and poetry in expressing male-male desire. Beyond the symposium and the gymnasium, literature and visual arts provided rich avenues for articulating and celebrating attraction between men. Particularly in the context of pederasty, you would encounter lyrical poems, like those by Sappho, though more famous for female-female love. Male poets also expressed these themes, or that explicitly praise the beauty of young boys and articulate the erased's longing and affection. These poems weren't hidden, they were part of the literary canon, recited and admired. They provided a vocabulary and a cultural framework for understanding and expressing these relationships, elevating them beyond mere physical acts. It's a mainstream historical fact that ancient Greek poetry openly expressed male-male desire, particularly in the context of pederasty. Visualize the intricate scenes on Athenian vases depicting older men pursuing or interacting intimately with younger boys. These images, often found on drinking cups used at symposia, were part of the visual landscape of male social life. They weren't meant to be hidden or shameful, but served as a reflection of accepted social dynamics. You might even find yourself tracing the elegant lines of a figure on a vase, recognizing the familiar patterns of pursuit and admiration. It's almost as if art was a mirror, reflecting the accepted realities of their desires back to them. The prevailing academic discussion explores the extent to which these artistic depictions idealized pederasty, and whether they truly reflected the full complexity, including potential power imbalances, of real-life relationships. A quirky tidbit. Some vase paintings depict scenes of athletic training where the older Erases is shown offering gifts or symbolic gestures to the Eromenos, subtly hinting at the dynamic of the relationship outside the sexual act itself. These small details add layers of meaning to their visual culture. Now, let's turn our attention to a truly intriguing, though less well-documented aspect: female-female relationships and desire. While male sexuality is ostensibly documented, the lives and intimate relationships of women in ancient Greece are often obscured by the patriarchal nature of the surviving sources. However, glimpses emerge that suggest the existence of female-female affection and potentially sexual relationships. Imagine the island of Lesbos, particularly the city of Mytilene, and the figure of Sappho, one of the greatest lyric poets of antiquity. Her surviving fragments of poetry openly expressed passionate love, longing, and desire between women, particularly within a community of aristocratic girls and young women. These poems speak of beauty, shared experiences, and intense emotional bonds, often in overtly sensual terms. It's a mainstream historical fact that Sappho's poetry provides the most significant evidence of female-female desire in ancient Greece. However, the nature and extent of these relationships are subjects of continuous scholarly debate. Were they primarily platonic mentorships, akin to male pederasty, but with an intense emotional and aesthetic dimension? Or did they involve physical intimacy? The exact meaning of Sappho's verses, often fragmented and open to interpretation, is fiercely contested. You might find yourself piecing together scattered lines, trying to imagine the lives and loves of these women, often confined to the gyneceum or female-centric educational environments. It's almost as if the historical record has a veil over it, only occasionally lifting to reveal tantalizing hints. The general societal structure, which kept women largely segregated from men and often confined to female company theoretically, created an environment where deep bonds, emotional and potentially physical, could form between women. You might imagine groups of women sharing intimate moments, supporting each other in a world largely dominated by men. The lack of condemnation for female-female relationships in surviving legal or philosophical texts, unlike the explicit condemnations for male homosexuality in later Roman and Christian periods, has led some scholars to argue that they were simply ignored or not considered a threat to the patriarchal order, as they did not challenge male control over lineage. A quirky tidbit: the very word lesbian derives from the island of Lesbos and Sappho's association with female-female love, showcasing her lasting impact on the vocabulary of sexuality. This linguistic legacy itself testifies to a historical reality that, while dimly lit, was undeniably present. You're now grappling with the fascinating, yet frustratingly elusive, topic of female-female desire in ancient Greece. The scarcity of direct historical evidence, especially compared to the abundant discussions of male sexuality, leaves much to the imagination and scholarly interpretation. Yet, the tantalizing fragments of Sappho's poetry continue to whisper tales of intense, emotional and possibly physical connections between women. This historical silence on female sexuality isn't necessarily proof of its absence, but rather a reflection of whose voices were recorded and whose lives were deemed worthy of detailed documentation in a male-dominated society. Imagine the lives of these women, perhaps confined to their homes or women's quarters, or participating in female-only rituals and educational settings. In such close-knit environments, it's not hard to conceive of deep bonds forming, bonds that could transcend mere friendship and blossom into affection, desire, and intimacy. The prevailing scholarly discussion fiercely debates whether these relationships were simply strong emotional friendships, or if they routinely involved physical intimacy. It's a debate that may never be definitively settled, but the very existence of the question challenges modern assumptions about monolithic sexual norms. A quirky tidbit: some interpretations of artwork, like certain vase paintings, occasionally show women in intimate, affectionate poses with each other, though these are often ambiguous and open to multiple readings. It's almost like finding tiny, almost imperceptible brushstrokes that hint at a larger, hidden picture. These visual cues, coupled with poetic fragments, are the closest we often get to understanding the private worlds of ancient Greek women. Now, let's turn our attention to the religious and cultic expressions of sexuality beyond mere fertility rites. While we've discussed Dionysian revelry, there were other lesser-known, often more esoteric, practices that intertwined the sacred with the sexual in fascinating ways. Imagine venturing into the mysteries of Demeter and Persephone at Eleusis, the famous Eleusinian mysteries. While the exact rituals were secret, involving vows of silence for initiates, it's known that they were agricultural fertility cults. Some scholars have posited that elements of the ritual might have included symbolic or suggestive acts related to fertility and reproduction, designed to bring abundance to the land and human beings. You wouldn't find explicit sexual acts openly performed, but the underlying themes were undeniably tied to the generative power of nature. It's a mainstream historical fact that the Eleusinian mysteries were one of the most important religious cults in ancient Greece, drawing initiates from all over the Greek world. Beyond the Eleusinian mysteries, smaller, more localized cults might have incorporated elements of sexual expression. These practices often offered a temporary release from societal norms, allowing participants to experience a heightened state of spiritual or communal unity. You might hear hushed whispers about certain nighttime rituals or offerings made to deities associated with passion and desire. The enduring scholarly debate often questions the true extent of sexual license in these mystery cults. Were they literally orgiastic, or was the sexual content primarily symbolic and metaphorical? The secretive nature of many of these rites makes definitive answers elusive, a quirky tidbit. Some ancient sources mention phallic processions, not just in the context of Dionysus, but also in other local festivals, honoring various deities, showcasing the widespread acceptance of the phallus as a symbol of life and fertility across different religious contexts. It's almost as if the very land breathed with sexual symbolism, intertwined with the divine. Let's consider the concepts of beauty and aesthetics in relation to sexual attraction in more detail. Building on our earlier discussion, for the Greeks, beauty was not just an external quality. It was often seen as an outward manifestation of inner virtue, a concept known as kalakatetheia, the noble and good. This meant that physical attractiveness was intrinsically linked to moral worth, making it a powerful magnet for desire. You would see this ethos reflected everywhere, from the perfectly proportioned temples to the lifelike sculptures that adorned public spaces. The human form, especially the male body, was celebrated for its symmetry, its muscularity, and its grace. This constant exposure to idealized forms undoubtedly influenced what was considered sexually attractive. To be beautiful was to be worthy of admiration and often worthy of desire. It's a mainstream historical fact that physical beauty was highly valued in ancient Greek society, often associated with virtue and excellence. This appreciation for beauty was a key driver in pederastic relationships, where the Erasts was attracted to the physical perfection of the Erythmunos. But it wasn't just physical. As we discussed with Plato, this physical attraction could be seen as a stepping stone to appreciating intellectual and moral beauty. You might hear philosophers debating whether true beauty lies in the body or in the soul, but always acknowledging the initial power of physical attraction. The prevailing academic discussion continues to explore the extent to which the idealization of beauty created pressures on individuals, particularly young men, to conform to certain physical standards to gain social acceptance and sexual attention. It reminds you that even in a seemingly permissive society, aesthetic ideals could shape individual experiences of desire. You're now fully attuned to the pervasive influence of beauty in ancient Greek society, a constant, silent force shaping everything from personal aspirations to public interactions, and, of course, sexual attraction. This aesthetic lens colored their entire worldview making physical perfection an almost divine quality. A quirky tidbit: the Greeks even had specific terms for different types of beauty, like kalos for formal, statuesque beauty, and eupeia for gracefulness in movement. Imagine a society where people discussed the nuances of someone's physical attractiveness with the same vocabulary you might use for art criticism. It's almost as if they said, let's admire every curve, every muscle, and then, perhaps, we'll see where that admiration leads. Now, let's explore the role of banquets and symposia in facilitating sexual encounters. While we've discussed the symposium as a male-dominated social event, its specific function as a stage for sexual overtures and consummation deserves a closer look. Imagine the scene: the wine flowing, the discussions lively, and the atmosphere growing increasingly relaxed. These gatherings were designed to foster camaraderie among men, but they were also prime environments for sexual liaisons. Hetairai were often present, their wit and beauty adding to the allure of the evening. They would engage in conversation, entertain with music and dance, and ultimately offer sexual companionship to the male guests. You might see a man discreetly signaling to a Hetaira, or hear negotiations for her services for the night, all within the accepted social framework of the symposium. It's a mainstream historical fact that symposia were common venues for sexual encounters between male citizens and courtesans. Furthermore, these events were often where pederastic relationships blossomed or were reinforced. The older could engage with his Araminos in a more intimate setting, away from the strictures of daily public life. The shared wine, the intellectual discussions, and the relaxed atmosphere created an ideal environment for the expression of affection and desire between them. You might observe a poet reciting verses about Eros to a young man, their eyes meeting in a shared understanding that went beyond the spoken words. It's almost as if the symposium was a carefully constructed bubble where certain desires could be freely expressed without immediate public judgment. The prevailing scholarly discussion often debates the degree of spontaneity versus expectation in these sexual encounters. Were they always prearranged, or could genuine romantic or sexual connections form organically during these events? The truth likely lies in a spectrum, from deliberate arrangements to serendipitous encounters. It reveals the symposium as a highly dynamic social space, where boundaries were explored and often crossed. A quirky tidbit: some symposia even included komos, a drunken procession through the streets after the main event, often involving singing, dancing, and general revelry. This unruly coda to the elegant symposium could sometimes lead to more uninhibited, impromptu sexual encounters in the darkened streets. It's almost like the ancient Greek version of a wild after-party. Next, let's delve into the philosophical and literary debates surrounding sexual pleasure versus procreation. While the pragmatic need for heirs was paramount, especially for women, Greek thinkers often grappled with the inherent tension between the pursuit of pleasure and the societal function of reproduction. Imagine Plato or Aristotle pondering in their philosophical treatises whether pleasure hedon was inherently good or bad, and how it related to virtue. While they recognized the necessity of procreation for the continuation of the polis, they also explored the nature of desire and its role in human life. Some philosophers might argue for moderation in all pleasures, including sexual ones, seeing excessive indulgence as a distraction from higher intellectual pursuits. Others might acknowledge pleasure as a natural part of human existence, but subordinate it to civic duty or the pursuit of kalikotothea. It's a mainstream historical fact that Greek philosophy often debated the role and morality of pleasure, For women, this debate was largely academic, as their sexual role was almost entirely defined by procreation. For men, however, it was a lived tension. A man could enjoy sexual pleasure from a hetera or a young man without the intent of procreation, yet he was still expected to produce heirs with his wife. The ongoing scholarly debate explores whether these philosophical discussions truly shaped individual sexual behavior, or if they primarily served as intellectual exercises for the elite. Divorced from the realities of everyday life, it highlights the often wide gap between abstract thought and practical action. A quirky tidbit, Epicurus, a later Greek philosopher, famously advocated for the pursuit of pleasure as the highest good, though he defined pleasure not as wild indulgence, but as a state of tranquility and freedom from pain, often achieved through moderate living. It's almost as if he said, enjoy yourself, but don't overdo it, or you'll regret it in the morning. This nuanced view of pleasure further complicates any simplistic understanding of ancient Greek attitudes. You're now truly appreciating the depth of ancient Greek thought, where even something as fundamental as pleasure wasn't a simple concept, but a subject for profound intellectual debate. This philosophical lens, however, primarily belonged to the elite male citizens, providing them with frameworks to rationalize or categorize their own diverse sexual experiences. Let's shift our focus to the practical aspects of contraception and abortion in ancient Greece. While not always openly discussed, there is evidence to suggest that ancient Greeks had knowledge of and practiced various methods to control conception and terminate pregnancies, even if their efficacy by modern standards was questionable. Imagine a woman, perhaps a hetera or a wife, trying to space her pregnancies. They might have relied on a range of herbal remedies, some of which are mentioned in ancient medical texts. For instance, the silphium plant, now extinct, was famously used as a contraceptive and abortifacient, so much so that its image appeared on coins from Cyrene. Other plants, like pennyroyal or wild carrot seeds, were also believed to have contraceptive properties. You might hear hushed whispers about certain concoctions passed down through generations of women, or sought from experienced midwives. It's a mainstream historical fact that ancient Greeks used various plant-based remedies for birth control. Abortion was also practiced, though often considered more risky and potentially condemned depending on the context and the prevailing philosophical views. Plato, for example, suggested that in an ideal state, abortion might be permitted for eugenic reasons, while Hippocratic oath, in its traditional form, forbids physicians from giving a pessary to produce abortion. This shows a lack of universal consensus and the moral complexities surrounding the issue. You can imagine a woman facing a desperate choice, seeking out remedies or assistance to avoid an unwanted pregnancy, highlighting the agency, albeit limited, and often dangerous, that some women exercised over their reproductive lives. The prevailing scholarly discussion explores the varying legal and social attitudes towards abortion across different city-states and historical periods. Was it viewed as murder, or more as a private matter? A quirky tidbit, some ancient magical papyri contain spells or amulets intended to prevent conception or ensure fertility, blending the practical with the superstitious in reproductive matters. It's almost as if they said, let's try the herbs, but also, let's consult the stars, just in case. This dual approach highlights their reliance on both empirical observation and supernatural belief. Now, let's consider the fascinating phenomenon of cross-cultural sexual influences. Ancient Greece, being a hub of trade and conquest, was not isolated. Its sexual norms were undoubtedly shaped, however subtly, by contact with other civilizations, and in turn, influenced them. Imagine a Greek merchant traveling to Egypt or Persia, encountering societies with different norms around marriage, nudity, and sexual expression. The Egyptians, for instance, had different attitudes towards female sexuality and marital fidelity, while some Eastern cultures practiced polygamy. These encounters would inevitably bring new ideas and practices into the Greek consciousness, even if they weren't always adopted. You might hear a traveler recounting exotic tales from foreign lands, perhaps describing practices that seem shocking or alluring by Greek standards. It's a mainstream historical fact that cultural exchange with neighboring civilizations introduced diverse social practices to the Greek world. The long-standing scholarly debate often focuses on the influence of Near Eastern cultures on Greek pedophilia. Was it an indigenous Greek development, or did it draw inspiration from practices in the ancient Near East? The evidence is complex and highly debated, highlighting the difficulty of pinpointing precise origins for cultural phenomena. This cross-cultural dynamic suggests a constant, subtle interplay of ideas, even in areas as intimate as sexual behavior. You might find yourself wondering if, perhaps, a daring Greek sailor brought home a new perspective on desire from his travels, subtly shifting the currents of local opinion. A quirky tidbit: some Greek myths, like that of Cybele, an Anatolian mother goddess, involved ecstatic, sometimes self-mutilating, rituals performed by male devotees who castrated themselves to become priests. This extreme form of religious devotion, often associated with a rejection of conventional sexuality, likely seemed utterly alien and terrifying to most Greeks, yet it existed on the fringes of their awareness. It showcases the vast spectrum of human, sexual, and religious expression that they were, at times, exposed to. Finally, let's briefly touch upon the concept of sexual humor and satire. Despite the solemn philosophical debates and rigid social structures, ancient Greeks clearly had a robust sense of humor about sex, often using it for comedic effect in plays and everyday banter. You would encounter comedies like those of Aristophanes, filled with explicit sexual jokes, phallic props, and bawdy references. These plays were performed in public theaters, before large audiences, demonstrating a communal comfort with sexual themes in a comedic context. You might hear exaggerated discussions of male prowess, witty innuendos about illicit affairs, or satirical jabs at social figures through their sexual habits. It's a mainstream historical fact that ancient Greek comedy frequently employed explicit sexual humor. You are now experiencing the light-hearted side of ancient Greek sexuality, a testament to their ability to laugh at human foibles, even the most intimate ones. This use of humor wasn't about condemnation. It was about shared recognition of universal desires and absurdities. The ongoing scholarly debate often explores the social function of such humor. Was it purely for entertainment? Or did it serve as a subtle form of social commentary, or even a release valve for societal tensions around sex? It suggests a complex relationship between public discourse and private behavior. A quirky tidbit: the phallic symbol, often seen on comedic costumes in plays, wasn't just for shock value. It sometimes served as a symbol of fertility and good fortune, adding a layer of symbolic meaning even to the bawdiest jokes. It's almost as if they said, let's make them laugh, and maybe bless the audience while we're at it. This playful integration of the sacred and the profane in humor highlights a distinct cultural comfort. Now, let's explore the economic aspects of sex beyond prostitution. While prostitution was the most overt form of sexual commerce, sex also played a role in other economic relationships, often more subtly. Imagine a wealthy patron supporting a young man in a pederastic relationship. While not a direct monetary transaction for sexual favors, the eraseds might provide gifts, education, or social connections that significantly benefited the era. This could be seen as an informal exchange, where sexual affection was intertwined with patronage and advancement. You might hear whispers about a powerful man's generosity towards a particular youth, understanding that this generosity came with certain expectations. While not as explicit as payment for sex, it certainly had an economic dimension, particularly for young men from less affluent backgrounds seeking social mobility. It's a mainstream historical fact that patronage systems often involved complex relationships, sometimes including sexual elements. You can almost feel the unspoken agreements, the subtle give and take that characterize these arrangements. Similarly, as we discussed with concubinage, particularly involving enslaved women, their sexual availability contributed to the economic value they held for their masters. Their bodies were assets, and their sexual labor, whether within the household or in a brothel, generated wealth or convenience. This commodification of human beings for sexual purposes underscores the brutal economic realities of slavery in the ancient world. The prevailing scholarly discussion often critiques the tendency of some historical interpretations to romanticize or overlook the exploitative dimensions of these relationships, especially when it came to those without power. A quirky tidbit: in some cases, the gifts given in pederastic relationships could be quite elaborate and valuable, almost like a form of reverse dowry or investment in the youth's future, further blurring the lines between affection and economic exchange. It's almost as if they said, let's ensure their education, and maybe a little affection will follow. Next, let's consider the role of public festivals and processions in sexual expression. Beyond the Dionysian revelry, many other civic and religious festivals incorporated elements that, while not explicitly sexual, created a heightened atmosphere conducive to flirtation, courtship, and sometimes more open displays of affection. Imagine the grand Panathenaic procession in Athens, a celebration in honor of Athena. While primarily a solemn religious event, any large gathering of people, particularly in a vibrant city, inevitably creates opportunities for social interaction and the display of one's attractiveness. You'd see young men and women, though the latter would be carefully chaperoned, adorned in their finest clothing, participating in the procession or observing from the sidelines. These were rare occasions for wider public visibility, particularly for women, offering a chance to be seen and admired, however fleetingly. It's a mainstream historical fact that public festivals provided important social and ritualistic contexts for communities. Less formal festivals, or even local celebrations, could be even more conducive to romantic and sexual encounters. The shared food, wine, music, and sense of communal celebration could lower inhibitions and foster a more relaxed atmosphere. You might see couples, perhaps already acquainted, engaging in more overt public displays of affection than would be typical. On an ordinary day, the enduring scholarly debate often questions the true level of promiscuity. At these festivals, were they truly periods of sexual license, or did social norms still largely hold sway, albeit with some relaxed boundaries? A quirky tidbit: some ancient Greek sources describe young men and women exchanging playful banter or flirtatious glances during these processions, a subtle form of courtship that might lead to later, more private encounters. It's almost as if they said, "Let's put on our best robes and see who catches whose eye amidst the grandeur." These moments, however brief, were significant in a society where public interaction between genders was otherwise limited. Finally, let's turn to the fascinating question of sexual identity and self-perception. Given the ancient Greek focus on active-passive roles rather than object choice, how did individuals actually perceive their own desires and identities? This is a challenging question, as it requires us to step into their shoes without imposing modern psychological categories. You are now pondering one of the most profound and perhaps unanswerable questions about ancient Greek sexuality. How did an individual truly feel about their desires? And how did they construct their own sexual identity, especially in a world so different from yours? Since the concept of gay or straight as inherent orientations didn't exist in their vocabulary, self-perception must have been radically different. Imagine a free Athenian man. He might be attracted to women for marriage and procreation, and simultaneously be deeply drawn to younger men for intellectual companionship and sexual pleasure. For him, these attractions likely wouldn't have been seen as contradictory or mutually exclusive, but simply as different facets of his multifaceted desire. He might not have felt the need to label himself in the way you might. His identity was tied to being a free male citizen, and his sexual expression was largely viewed as an extension of his status and natural urges, varying depending on the context and partner. It's a mainstream historical fact that ancient Greeks did not categorize sexual orientation in the same way modern Western societies do. You might find yourself liberatingly free from the need to put a label on every attraction. Just for a moment, the prevalent scholarly discussion grapples with whether individuals felt any internal conflict over their desires, or if the lack of a rigid categorization simply meant less psychological distress over same-sex attractions than in later, more judgmental eras. Did a man who preferred male companions secretly wish he preferred women, or was it simply a matter of preference within an accepted spectrum? The sources are largely silent on personal psychological states, making this a complex area of interpretation. A quirky tidbit: some philosophers did discuss the concept of acrasia, or weakness of will, where one's desires might overpower their rational judgment. This wasn't specifically about sexual orientation, but about any desire that led one astray, suggesting that self-control, rather than the object of desire, was the primary moral concern. It's almost as if they said, it's not who you want, but whether you can control how much you want them. Next, let's consider the role of public opinion and reputation in shaping sexual behavior. While many aspects of Greek sexuality appear free, honor and reputation were paramount, especially for free citizens, and public opinion could be a powerful regulator of conduct. Imagine a prominent citizen, while he might engage in certain behaviors privately or within the accepted confines of the symposium or brothel, blatant or excessive displays that violated social decorum could still damage his reputation. For example, while pederasty was accepted, an arist who was perceived as too predatory, too obsessed with pleasure, or who failed to act as a proper mentor might face social criticism. Similarly, a man who neglected his civic duties or spent too much time in brothels might be seen as lacking seriousness or self-control. You would hear whispers and gossip in the agora, subtly undermining a man's standing. It's a mainstream historical fact that reputation was incredibly important in ancient Greek society, influencing one's social and political power. For women, of course, public opinion was an even more oppressive force. Any hint of impropriety, any deviation from the modest, secluded ideal, could lead to complete social ruin. Their reputation was their most fragile and valuable asset. You can almost feel the constant pressure on women to conform, to present an impeccable public facade, for fear of gossip and ostracization. It's almost as if every woman lived under the constant scrutiny of an invisible jury. The ongoing scholarly debate explores the extent to which this social pressure genuinely deterred illicit behavior, or if it merely drove it further underground. A quirky tidbit: ancient Greek comedies sometimes lampooned public figures by exaggerating their sexual exploits or preferences, demonstrating how humor could be used as a tool for social commentary and reputation management. Imagine a politician's alleged dalliances becoming fodder for a playwright's latest comedy, much to his public chagrin. Finally, let's explore the intersection of religion, myth, and ritual in shaping attitudes towards gender roles and sexuality. We've touched upon various aspects, but the holistic way these elements intertwined to create a comprehensive worldview is truly remarkable. You would find that the divine realm, as depicted in myths, provided models for human behavior, including sexual behavior. The stories of Zeus's numerous affairs, Aphrodite's powerful desires, or Dionysus's ecstatic revelry presented a universe where sexuality was a fundamental, often chaotic, force. These myths didn't offer a single, rigid moral code, but rather a kaleidoscopic view of desires, power, and its consequences, both creative and destructive. It's a mainstream historical fact that Greek mythology heavily influenced cultural norms and understandings of human nature, including sexuality, religious rituals, from the great Pan-Hellenic games to local fertility rites, often reinforced gender roles. Women typically participated in rituals related to fertility, domesticity, and the cycles of life, while men engaged in cults associated with warfare, civic life, and intellectual pursuits. However, as we discussed, some cults, like the Dionysian mysteries, offered temporary reversals or blurred gender lines, providing a space for liminal experiences. You might witness a procession dedicated to Demeter, celebrating female fertility and the cycles of planting and harvest, and then, later, observe a male-centric ritual dedicated to Ares, emphasizing strength and aggression. The scholarly debate frequently asks whether these religious and mythical narratives truly reflected actual gender relations, or if they often presented idealized or even compensatory versions of reality. You are now experiencing the pervasive influence of religion and myth, not just as stories, but as living frameworks that subtly guided, and sometimes explicitly shaped, ancient Greek perceptions of gender and sexuality. It was a worldview where the divine was constantly reflected in human actions, and vice versa. A quirky tidbit: some ancient Greek religious sanctuaries, like that of Aphrodite at Corinth, were known to employ sacred prostitutes, both male and female, as part of their cultic practices. These individuals were seen as serving the goddess directly, and their sexual acts were considered a form of worship, illustrating a direct sacred link to sexuality that would be utterly alien to many later religions. It's almost as if they said, let's honor the gods by embracing the very forces of life and desire they represent. Now, let's turn to the fascinating role of dreams and dream interpretation in understanding sexuality. For the ancient Greeks, dreams were not just random mental occurrences. They were often seen as messages from the gods, prophecies, or insights into one's inner state, including their desires and anxieties. Imagine a Greek citizen recounting a vivid dream to a dream interpreter, seeking meaning. Dreams involving sexual imagery or encounters were often taken very seriously, believed to reveal something about one's future, one's health, or one's hidden desires. For example, a dream about engaging in a particular sexual act might be interpreted as a sign of good fortune, or perhaps a warning about impending illness, depending on the context. You might hear someone describing a dream of being pursued by a satyr, or embracing a goddess, and the dream interpreter meticulously analyzing every detail for hidden significance. It's a mainstream historical fact that dream interpretation was a recognized practice in ancient Greece, often with medical and prophetic implications. These interpretations, found in ancient dream manuals, reveal a fascinating insight into their unconscious sexual landscape. They show what behaviors were deemed significant enough to warrant divine or prophetic attention, and how certain sexual acts or partners were symbolically understood. The prevailing scholarly debate often questions how much these interpretations reflected actual societal anxieties, and how much they simply projected cultural norms onto the symbolic language of dreams. It's a tantalizing glimpse into the psyche of the ancient Greek individual, revealing that even in their sleep, their culture's sexual framework held sway. A quirky tidbit: some dream interpretation guides suggested that dreaming of passive sexual roles for men could signify illness or misfortune, reinforcing the societal emphasis on the active role even in the subconscious mind. It's almost as if their societal expectations followed them even into their sleep. Next, let's consider the portrayal of sexual desire in tragedy and drama. While comedy often presented a humorous and explicit view of sex, Greek tragedy explored the destructive and often tragic consequences of uncontrolled passion, illicit desire, and sexual transgression. Imagine watching a play by Euripides, witnessing the unfolding of a narrative where eros, unchecked by reason or social constraint, leads to ruin. Think of Phaedra's consuming forbidden love for her stepson Hippolytus, which ultimately leads to death and destruction for all involved. Or Medea, driven by the intense desires of love and revenge. These plays weren't about celebrating sexual freedom, they were cautionary tales, exploring the dark side of passion when it violated social norms, familial bonds, or divine law. You would feel the weight of destiny, the inevitable downfall brought about by overwhelming, often illicit, desire. It's a mainstream historical fact that Greek tragedy often depicted the destructive power of uncontrolled passion, including sexual desire. These dramatic portrayals served a moral function, reinforcing societal boundaries and highlighting the dangers of hubris, excessive pride that could manifest in sexual transgression. While men might enjoy freedom, the tragic plays reminded them that even divine passions could lead to dire consequences if they violated sacred oaths or social order. The long-standing scholarly debate often focuses on whether these plays reflected actual anxieties about male sexual excesses, or if they primarily served as moral instruction, particularly for male citizens, about the importance of moderation and self-control. A quirky tidbit: the audience at these tragedies would often be composed entirely of men and boys, meaning these powerful cautionary tales about passion and its consequences were specifically directed at the very group that enjoyed the most sexual freedom. It's almost as if they said, "Go forth and enjoy, but remember these stories before you get too carried away." Finally, let's delve into the philosophical and practical aspects of sexual moderation and self-control. Sexuality, despite the perceived sexual liberality, particularly for men. The concept of Sexuality was a cornerstone of Greek ethics, influencing how even desire was ideally managed. You would hear philosophers like Aristotle advocating for moderation in all things, including pleasure. While acknowledging sexual desire as natural, they stressed the importance of reason dominating passion. For a free citizen, exercising self-control was a sign of virtue, maturity, and responsible citizenship. This didn't mean abstinence, but rather choosing appropriate partners, acting with decorum, and not allowing one's desires to become all-consuming to the detriment of one's civic duties or reputation. You might observe a man at a symposium politely declining more wine, demonstrating his sophrosyne in a setting ripe for indulgence. It's a mainstream historical fact that sophrosyne was a highly valued virtue in ancient Greek ethical thought. You are now considering the delicate balance in ancient Greek ethics, the pursuit of pleasure tempered by the ideal of self-control. This philosophical ideal of sophrosyne was not a call for oppression, but for mindful indulgence, a navigation of desire that affirmed a man's rational mastery over his impulses. The prevailing scholarly debate often questions how widely practiced this ideal was among the general populace, or if it remained primarily an aspiration for philosophers and the intellectual elite. It reveals a gap between the theoretical and the practical in human behavior. Quirky tidbit: some ancient sources portray Sophrosyne as being personified as a goddess or a divine quality, often associated with temperance and modesty, suggesting its profound importance in their moral universe. It's almost as if they said, let's enjoy life, but not so much that the gods get annoyed. Now, let's explore the intriguing, albeit often debated, topic of sexuality within cults of healing and prophecy. Beyond the more overt fertility rites, some sanctuaries and religious practices, particularly those associated with dream incubation or oracle consultation, implicitly or explicitly involved aspects of sexuality. Imagine visiting a healing sanctuary, perhaps one dedicated to Asclepius, the god of medicine. Here, supplicants would often sleep within the sacred precincts, hoping for divine dreams that would reveal cures or insights. While not overtly sexual, the act of sleeping in a temple, seeking divine favor, could create a liminal space where the unconscious, including sexual desires or anxieties, might manifest in dreams interpreted by priests. You might hear stories of individuals receiving cryptic dreams involving encounters with divine figures that had a sensual undertone, leading to a path of healing or spiritual guidance. It's a mainstream historical fact that dream incubation was a common practice in ancient Greek healing cults. Furthermore, some oracular sites, like Delphi, often had priestesses, Pythias, who delivered prophecies in a trance-like state. While their role was spiritual, the very act of channeling a divine voice, often in an altered state, sometimes had a powerful, almost mystical, intensity that could be interpreted in various ways by the male The ongoing scholarly debate often questions whether there was any implicit sexual component to the Pythias role, or if any perceived eroticism was purely projected onto her by the supplicants, given the male-dominated nature of the oracular consultation. It's a challenging area to interpret due to the limited and often biased nature of the sources. A quirky tidbit: some offerings found at healing sanctuaries include small terracotta figurines of body parts, sometimes explicitly sexual, organs placed as votives for healing or thanksgiving. This direct acknowledgement of the sexual body within a sacred context highlights their integrated view of human existence. It's almost as if they said, let's pray for our health, including all our parts. Next, let's consider the impact of philosophical schools on specific sexual behaviors. Beyond general ethical discussions, some philosophical groups or figures were known to adopt or reject certain sexual practices, influencing their followers and offering alternative models of living. Imagine walking past the Cynic philosophers, known for their radical rejection of social conventions, including those related to modesty and privacy. Diogenes, the most famous Cynic, purportedly engaged in public masturbation and other shocking behaviors to demonstrate his disdain for societal norms. While certainly extreme and not widely emulated, his actions highlight a philosophical challenge to conventional sexual decorum. You might overhear shocked whispers about the Cynics, seen as either brave truth-tellers or outrageous provocateurs. It's a mainstream historical fact that Cynic philosophers deliberately defied social conventions, including those surrounding sexual privacy. Conversely, some philosophical schools, like the Pythagoreans, advocated for strict asceticism, including sexual abstinence or severe moderation, as a path to spiritual purity or intellectual clarity. Their followers would adopt rigid diets and lifestyles, contrasting sharply with the more hedonistic aspects of Greek society. The prevailing scholarly debate discusses how much influence these radical philosophical stances had on mainstream society. Were they truly transformative, or merely niche practices for a select few? This spectrum of philosophical approaches to sex reveals the diversity of thought even within the seemingly uniform fabric of Greek culture. A quirky tidbit: Plato's Academy, while often associated with elevated, non-physical eros, was also a place where pederastic relationships were common, further illustrating the complex interplay between philosophical ideals and practical realities. It's almost as if they said, let's discuss the highest forms of love and also enjoy the more earthly ones. Finally, let's delve into the nuances of clothing, adornment, and their subtle sexual messages. While modern fashion often overtly signals sexuality, ancient Greek attire, particularly for men, carried its own set of subtle cues and symbolic meanings related to desirability and status. You would observe men at the gymnasium, their bodies glistening with oil, their nakedness, a statement of their free status and physical cultivation. But even when clothed, the way a man wore his chiton or himation tunic or cloak, the quality of the fabric, or the simple elegance of his adornment could convey messages about his social standing, his masculinity, and his attractiveness. Excessive ornamentation or overtly feminine dress on a man might be viewed with suspicion or ridicule, subtly hinting at perceived sexual deviance. It's a mainstream historical fact that clothing and personal appearance communicated social status and adherence to gender norms. You are now acutely aware that even in the seemingly simple drapery of ancient Greek clothing, subtle messages about status and sexual desirability were constantly being conveyed. Every fold of fabric, every splash of perfume, spoke volumes without uttering a single word. The ongoing scholarly debate explores how much personal style was a matter of individual choice versus strict adherence to social codes, particularly for those navigating the nuances of sexual expression. A quirky tidbit: some ancient Greek sources lament the perceived decline in masculine simplicity, complaining about young men who adopted overly luxurious or effeminate clothing, suggesting a perennial generational concern about blurring gender distinctions. even in attire. It's almost as if they said, kids these days, with their fancy tunics and their excessive use of olive oil. Now, let's explore the role of banishment and exile in policing sexual behavior. While some sexual expressions were tolerated, severe transgressions, particularly those that threatened family honor or civic order, could lead to social ostracism or even expulsion from the city. This punitive aspect reveals the limits of their sexual permissiveness. Imagine a citizen found guilty of a particularly egregious sexual offense, perhaps seducing a respectable married woman in a way that truly shamed her family, or engaging in a sexual act with a fellow citizen that was considered deeply dishonorable, for example, taking the passive role as an adult free man in a public setting. Such acts could lead to various penalties, including heavy fines, loss of civic rights, or even formal banishment from the polis. This was not a minor inconvenience. It was a devastating blow, stripping an individual of their identity, their community, and their livelihood. You might hear hushed warnings about certain behaviors that could lead to one being cast out from the city walls, serving as a powerful deterrent. It's a mainstream historical fact that ostracism and exile were significant punishments in ancient Greek city-states, often used to maintain social order. For women, as we've seen, the consequences of sexual transgression were even more severe and immediate, often leading to being sent back to their father's house in disgrace. Effectively, a form of social exile within their own family. This legal and social framework highlights that, while sexual norms were different, they were still fiercely enforced when deemed necessary to protect the patriarchy, family honor, or civic order. The prevailing academic discussion often examines the disproportionate impact of these punishments on women and lower status individuals, further revealing the deep inequalities embedded in the system. A quirky tidbit: some forms of public shaming, like placing a symbolic garland of disgrace on a man's door, were used to mark sexual transgressors, visually signaling their dishonor to the entire community. It's almost as if they said, we might be open-minded, but don't think for a second. You can escape public judgment for that. Next, let's turn to the economic realities for women in various sexual roles. Beyond their confinement to the household, women who engaged in sexual roles outside of marriage faced very different economic realities, often characterized by dependence or, for hetairai, a unique form of financial agency. Imagine a common prostitute, often an enslaved woman, working in a brothel. Her economic reality was dire, her body generating income for her owner, with little to no personal gain or freedom. She might live in squalor, with no prospects beyond her physical labor. This grim existence stands in stark contrast to the freedoms enjoyed by her male clients. You can almost feel the weight of their unending labor, a life stripped of dignity and choice. It's a mainstream historical fact that enslaved prostitutes were at the very bottom of the social and economic hierarchy. Conversely, consider the hetairai we've discussed. While their profession involved sexual services, their economic standing was vastly different. They often managed their own finances, owned property, and commanded high fees, sometimes accumulating considerable wealth. Their economic independence set them apart from respectable married women who were legally dependent on their husbands. This unique economic position granted them a form of agency and influence that few other women in ancient Greece possessed. You might hear tales of famous hetairai like Aspasia, who was not only a companion to Pericles, but a respected intellectual figure in her own right, demonstrating the potential for significant economic and social power within this unconventional role. The long-standing scholarly debate often asks whether the economic freedom of hetairai genuinely translated into personal liberation, or if they were still ultimately constrained by their reliance on male patronage and the volatile nature of their profession. A quirky tidbit: some hetairai would charge not just for sexual services, but also for their witty conversation or their musical performances at symposia, essentially monetizing their intellectual and artistic talents as well as their physical charms. It's almost as if they said, "You get a body and a brain for the price." This highlights their multifaceted value proposition. Finally, let's consider the impact of philosophical discussions on societal sexual norms. While philosophers might debate abstract concepts of eros and sophrosyne, how much did their ideas truly permeate everyday life and influence common sexual practices? You are now pondering the grand philosophical narratives of ancient Greece, wondering how deeply they truly resonated with the average citizen's daily sexual reality. While the intellectual elite might have grappled with the nuances of desire and moderation, the impact on common practices was likely complex and varied. The prevailing scholarly discussion often debates the trickle-down effect of philosophy. Did it significantly shape popular morality, or primarily provide a framework for the educated to discuss existing behaviors? It's a classic chicken and egg question in intellectual history. Imagine a busy merchant or a farmer. While they might admire the wisdom of a Socrates or a Plato, their sexual lives were likely more governed by pragmatic concerns, social opportunities, and inherited customs than by intricate philosophical arguments about the ascent of eros. For them, sex was likely a more straightforward affair, fulfilling biological urges, procreating, and seeking pleasure where it was available and permissible within their social standing. You might hear them talk about the practicalities of marriage, or the going rates at the brothel, rather than the platonic ideal of beauty. It's a mainstream historical fact that philosophical discussions were often a pursuit of the leisured elite, whose lives differed greatly from the working classes. However, philosophical ideas weren't entirely isolated. They provided a language and a set of concepts that could be used to interpret or justify existing behaviors, or to articulate aspirational ideals. For instance, the philosophical discussions around pederasty, framing it as a mentorship for virtue, likely provided a legitimizing framework for a practice that was already socially prevalent among the aristocracy. It's almost as if they said, "Let's give our natural inclinations a scholarly veneer." A quirky tidbit: some philosophers actively challenged certain popular sexual norms, like the cynics we discussed, whose radical lifestyles often served as living critiques of societal hypocrisy, showing that philosophical thought could also be a force for rebellion. Finally, let's bring our journey to a close by examining the legacy of ancient Greek sexuality in modern thought and culture. You've delved into a world that, in many ways, feels utterly alien, yet its echoes reverberate surprisingly powerfully in your own time. You see, the rediscovery and reinterpretation of ancient Greek texts and art during the Renaissance and later periods profoundly influenced Western thought on sexuality. The concepts of male-male love, the idealization of the male body, and the philosophical discussions on eros have inspired countless artists, writers, and thinkers throughout history. For centuries, the relative openness of Greek society provided a historical precedent for discussions that were otherwise suppressed in more conservative eras. It's a mainstream historical fact that classical Greek culture has profoundly influenced Western intellectual and artistic traditions, including those related to sexuality. However, this legacy is often filtered and selectively interpreted. For example, the pervasive presence of female confinement and the exploitation of slaves are often downplayed or ignored in popular, romanticized views of ancient Greece. The focus tends to be on the free expression of male desire, overlooking the profound inequalities that underpinned it. You might find yourself critically examining modern, cultural phenomena that cherry-pick aspects of Greek sexuality without acknowledging its full, complex, and often uncomfortable context. The long-standing scholarly debate continuously challenges these simplistic or anachronistic interpretations, striving for a more nuanced and historically accurate understanding. This selective legacy means that while terms like platonic love have entered your common vocabulary, reflecting the philosophical ideal of spiritual eros, the equally prevalent physical realities of Greek pederasty are often less comfortably discussed. Similarly, the term lesbian from Lesbos and Sappho has become a modern identity, yet the historical context of Sappho's community remains shrouded in scholarly debate and historical silence. It's almost as if society chooses which aspects of history it wants to remember and which it prefers to forget or redefine. You are now equipped with a deeper, more nuanced understanding of what sex was really like in ancient Greece. It was a world of vast male freedom, stringent female restriction, accepted pederasty, open prostitution, pervasive aesthetic appreciation, and a general lack of moral guilt that would stun many modern observers. It was a world where sexual expression was interwoven with philosophy, religion, art, and social hierarchy, a tapestry far richer and more complex than any simple label could convey. You have now traveled through time, experiencing the multifaceted and often contradictory landscape of ancient Greek sexuality. As the echoes of symposium laughter and philosophical debate begin to soften, and the vibrant images of gymnasia fade, you carry with you a richer, more nuanced understanding of a world that viewed desire in ways profoundly different from your own. The final threads of our journey weave together, allowing you to settle back into your present, yet forever altered by the journey. You recall the stark contrast between the broad, sexual liberties enjoyed by men and the severe confinement imposed upon women, a patriarchal bedrock that defined their society. Remember how a man could navigate a landscape of hetairi, young eromenoi, and casual encounters, all while his wife remained cloistered, her sexuality strictly bound to procreation. And the lineage, this fundamental gender imbalance, you now understand, wasn't a minor detail, but the very scaffolding upon which their sexual norms were built. It serves as a potent reminder that freedom in one context often rested on the suppression of it. In another, you've witnessed the surprisingly open role of prostitution, a legally sanctioned and culturally integrated aspect of urban life, providing outlets for male desire without threatening the purity of the marital line. The ease with which explicit sexual themes appeared in art and comedy, and the lack of inherent sin associated with desire, particularly for men, revealed a cultural comfort that stands in stark contrast to later Western moral frameworks. It's almost as if they shrugged off the guilt that would later plague centuries of human sexual expression, approaching desire with a more pragmatic, almost naturalistic acceptance. Think of the gymnasium, where male bodies were celebrated in the nude, a testament to a profound aesthetic appreciation that effortlessly intertwined with sexual attraction. Remember the active, passive roles, a fluid categorization that replaced your modern fixed notions of orientation, demonstrating how even identity itself can be shaped by cultural context. These are not just historical facts. They are keys to unlocking a deeper appreciation for the sheer malleability of human societal structures and beliefs. As our exploration softly concludes, let the images gently fade. The distant sound of an owlos from a fading symposium, the scent of olive oil from a sun-drenched gymnasium, the murmur of philosophical debate by lamplight, they all recede into the quiet expanse of history. You are no longer there, but the echoes linger, profound and thought-provoking. You've glimpsed a world where sex was not just an act, but a metaphor, a philosophical problem, a religious offering, and an integral part of social hierarchy. It was a world of both unbridled expression and rigid control, of celebrated beauty and stark exploitation. This complexity, this tapestry of contradictions, is what makes ancient Greece so endlessly fascinating, and such a powerful mirror for your own modern inquiries into identity, desire, and freedom. Now, as the last remnants of ancient Athens drift away, you can truly relax. The journey is complete, the insights gathered. Let your mind clear, leaving only the soft hum of understanding. Sweet dreams.